Hello everyone, and welcome back to Mr. Sleepy Crime. I know many of you enjoy listening to these stories as you fall asleep. So before you drift off, I'd love for you to leave a comment letting me know where in the world you're tuning in from. And if you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like and subscribe. It really helps the channel grow. Before we begin, I want to acknowledge that this story involves real people and real tragedies. We tell these stories not for entertainment, but to remember the victims and perhaps help others recognize the warning signs that could prevent similar tragedies. For the best experience, feel free to lower the volume a little, just enough to let the story gently carry you off to sleep. Alright, please get comfortable, dim the lights, and let's dive into tonight's first story. On a warm summer evening in central Illinois, two hikers decided to explore the trails of Funk's Grove Nature Preserve. It was July 2nd, 2017, and the forest was alive with birdsong and the rustle of leaves in the breeze. They walked deeper into the wooded area, enjoying the peaceful solitude that nature provides, when something caught their eye, something that didn't belong among the trees and undergrowth. What they discovered would shatter the tranquility of this quiet preserve forever. There, partially concealed in the wooded area, lay the body of a woman. She was later identified as Teresa Ann Pullman, a 47-year-old mother from East Peoria, Illinois. The scene told a story of violence, of struggle, of a life ended in the most brutal way imaginable. And as investigators would soon discover, the person responsible for Teresa's death was someone who should have loved her most. This is the story of Teresa Pullman and the daughter who killed her. To understand what happened in those woods at Funk's Grove, we need to go back to the beginning to understand who Teresa Pullman was and the complicated life she led. Teresa was born in 1969 in Morton, Illinois, a small town in the heart of the Midwest. But her childhood was far from the idyllic picture one might imagine of small-town America. Teresa grew up in what could only be described as a deeply dysfunctional family environment. The cycle of addiction ran through her family like a dark current, pulling everyone into its depths. In a detail that seems almost impossible to comprehend, Teresa began using cocaine with her own mother when she was still very young. The very person who should have protected her from the world's dangers instead introduced her to one of its most destructive forces. This early exposure to drugs would cast a long shadow over Teresa's entire life. Addiction became her constant companion, a demon she could never quite shake. Mental health challenges plagued her too, though it's hard to say where the addiction ended and the illness began. They fed off each other, creating a cycle that seemed impossible to break. As Teresa grew into adulthood, the consequences of her troubled upbringing became painfully clear. She struggled to maintain stability in her life. Relationships came and went. Jobs were hard to hold down. And somewhere along the way, Teresa became pregnant. In the early 1990s, Teresa gave birth to a baby girl. She named her Christine. But Teresa knew, in whatever clarity she could muster through the fog of addiction and mental illness, that she was in no position to raise a child. The same cycle that had claimed her threatened to claim her daughter too. And so, in what might have been one of the most selfless decisions of her troubled life, Teresa made arrangements for Christine to be adopted. The adoption was handled within the family. Teresa's cousins agreed to take Christine and raise her as their own. It was a closed arrangement, the kind where the biological parent steps away entirely, allowing the child to grow up without the complications of their birth parents' troubled life. Christine would grow up knowing she was adopted, but the details of her biological mother's struggles would remain largely hidden from her childhood years. For Teresa, life continued its difficult trajectory. The addiction persisted. The mental health struggles continued. She moved through East Peoria, a working-class city along the Illinois River, trying to piece together some semblance of stability, but never quite achieving it. Those who knew her during these years described a woman who was fighting battles most people couldn't see, struggling with demons that had been with her since childhood. While Teresa struggled in East Peoria, Christine was growing up in what appeared to be a normal, stable home with her adoptive parents. She had the things Teresa couldn't provide: a roof over her head, regular meals, parents who weren't lost in addiction. On the surface, Christine's childhood looked unremarkable, the kind of ordinary upbringing that Teresa herself had never known. But beneath that surface, something was stirring. By the time Christine turned 13, she began experimenting with drugs and alcohol. It was as if the addiction that had plagued Teresa's family had somehow found its way to Christine, despite the adoption, despite the separation, despite everything. Whether it was genetics, or learned behavior from early exposure before the adoption, or simply the pain of abandonment working its way out, Christine began following the same dark path her biological mother had walked. The substance abuse quickly escalated. By 16, Christine had dropped out of school. The fights with her adoptive parents became more frequent and more intense. The normal, stable childhood they had tried to provide seemed to be crumbling despite their best efforts. Christine was angry, rebellious, and spiraling. It was during these turbulent teenage years that Christine learned more about her biological mother. The veil of secrecy around her adoption began to lift, and Christine discovered the truth about Teresa's struggles with addiction and mental illness. Some experts who later examined the case believed that learning about the abuse Teresa had suffered as a child, and understanding the circumstances of her own birth, triggered something in Christine. The anger she felt toward her situation found a focus. The woman who had given birth to her and then given her away. At some point, Christine and Teresa reconnected. It's unclear exactly when or how this happened, but by Christine's early 20s, she was in contact with her biological mother. But this wasn't the heartwarming reunion story you might hope for. Instead of finding healing or closure, Christine seemed to find only more reasons for resentment. By 2017, Christine was 22 years old. She had a child of her own now, which added another layer of complexity to her relationship with Teresa. She had married briefly, but the marriage lasted only about a year before falling apart, and she was still struggling with addiction, still caught in the same web that had ensnared Teresa. Christine was also, according to court documents, working as a prostitute to support herself in a drug habit. This was something Teresa knew about, and it would ultimately become the catalyst for murder. In the summer of 2017, Christine was living in Washington, Illinois, another small town in the central part of the state. She had become friends with a young man named Matthew Isbell, who was 20 years old and lived in nearby Marquette Heights. What exactly drew these two together isn't entirely clear, but by early July they had formed a bond that would lead them both down a dark path. The relationship between Christine and her biological mother had become increasingly strained. Teresa, despite her own struggles and checkered past, was concerned about Christine's lifestyle. She was worried about her daughter's drug use, worried about her working as a prostitute, worried about the path Christine was on. In her own way, Teresa was trying to be a mother to the daughter she had given up years before. But Christine didn't see it as maternal concern. She saw it as judgment, as hypocrisy, as interference from a woman who had forfeited the right to be her mother when she gave her up for adoption. The resentment that had been building for years was reaching a breaking point. And then Teresa made a threat that would seal her fate. She told Christine that she was going to report her to the police for prostitution. Whether Teresa actually intended to follow through on this threat, or whether it was just an empty warning born of desperation and concern, we'll never know. But for Christine, it was the final straw. On the night of July 1st, 2017, Christine sent a text message to a friend. It was brief and chilling in its simplicity. "I'm killing my mother tonight." She wasn't joking. She wasn't being dramatic. She was stating a fact, announcing her intention with a cold clarity that would later serve as one of the most damning pieces of evidence against her. Christine reached out to Matthew Isbell. She told him what she was planning to do. She needed help, she said. She needed someone to drive them, to help her dispose of the body afterward. Most people, when confronted with such a request, would recoil in horror. They would try to talk their friend out of it, or they would call the police, or they would simply refuse to be any part of such a plan. Matthew Isbell said yes. The details of exactly how Christine convinced Teresa to get into Matthew's truck that night remains somewhat murky. Perhaps she claimed they were going for a drive to talk things out. Perhaps she promised to show her something. Whatever the excuse, Teresa got into the vehicle with her daughter and Matthew Isbell, not knowing that she would never make it home. They drove southwest from East Peoria, taking the winding roads that cut through the farmland of central Illinois. Their destination was Funk's Grove Nature Preserve, a popular spot for hikers and nature lovers located just south of Bloomington. During the day, it's a peaceful place where families walk the trails and enjoy the natural beauty of the Illinois prairie and woodland. But at night, it becomes something else entirely. Dark, isolated and far from any help. Matthew drove his truck down the roads that led into the preserve. The headlights cut through the darkness, illuminating the trees that pressed in on either side. When they reached a particularly secluded spot, deep in the wooded area where no one would hear screams, they stopped. What happened next was brutal and prolonged. The autopsy report would later reveal the full horror of Teresa's final moments. And even seasoned investigators were shaken by the savagery of the attack. Christine attacked her mother with a knife. She stabbed Teresa multiple times, the blade plunging into her neck and chest with terrible force. The medical examiner would later count nearly a dozen stab wounds. 2 of those wounds penetrated Teresa's heart, causing massive internal bleeding. But the stabbing wasn't enough. Christine also strangled her mother, wrapping her hands or something else around Teresa's throat and squeezing until Teresa could no longer breathe. And there was blunt force trauma to Teresa's skull, evidence that she had been beaten as well. Teresa fought back. She must have. The injuries suggested a struggle, a desperate attempt to survive, to escape from her own daughter's murderous rage. But in that isolated spot in the woods, with 2 attackers and no one to help her, Teresa's struggle was futile. She bled out there, in the dirt and leaves of Funk's Grove, her life draining away as her daughter and Matthew Esbel stood over her. The final cause of death would be listed as exsanguination, blood lost from the multiple stab wounds. When it was over, when Teresa was finally still, Christine and Matthew left her there. They didn't try to hide the body, didn't try to bury her or cover her with leaves. They simply abandoned Teresa's corpse in the woods and drove away. Blood was later found in the passenger seat area of Matthew's truck, a silent witness to the violence that had occurred. Christine's shirt too bore what appeared to be bloodstains. They had carried the evidence with them as they left the scene. July 2nd, 2017 dawned bright and warm. It was a beautiful summer day, the kind that draws people outdoors. The 2 hikers who set out to explore Funk's Grove Nature Preserve that morning were likely thinking about nothing more serious than enjoying the weather and getting some exercise. When they found Teresa's body, their peaceful morning was shattered. They immediately called 911, and within minutes the preserve was swarming with law enforcement. The McLean County Sheriff's Office took charge of the investigation. Deputies cordoned off the area with yellow tape and barricades. The Sugar Grove Nature Center, which managed part of the preserve, was temporarily closed. Investigators processed the scene carefully. They photographed everything, collected evidence, and tried to piece together what had happened. The body of a woman lay before them, and the violence of her death was immediately apparent. But who was she, and who had done this to her? The identification of Teresa Pullman came fairly quickly, likely through fingerprints or other identifying information. Once they knew who the victim was, investigators began the painstaking work of retracing her final days. Who had she been with? Where had she gone? Who might have wanted her dead? The investigation moved quickly. Within days, detectives had focused their attention on Christine Rausch and Matthew Isbell. The evidence was mounting. Witnesses who had seen them together with Teresa. The blood in the truck, the blood stains on Christine's clothing. And then there was that text message, the one Christine had sent the night of the murder. "I'm killing my mother tonight." On July 8th, 2017, less than a week after Teresa's body was discovered, both Christine and Matthew were arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. They were taken into custody and held without bail. The McLean County State's Attorney, Jason Chambers, issued a press release announcing the charges. He made it clear that these were allegations at this point, that both defendants were presumed innocent until proven guilty, but the evidence against them was substantial, and as the investigation continued, it only grew stronger. Under interrogation, Matthew Isbell cracked. Faced with the overwhelming evidence against him and the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison, he decided to cooperate with investigators. He told them everything. He confirmed that Christine had planned the murder. He admitted that he had driven them to Funk's Grove, knowing what Christine intended to do. He described how the murder had unfolded, though the details of who did what exactly remained somewhat murky. What was clear was that both of them had been involved. Both had played a role in Teresa's brutal death. Matthew's confession was detailed and damning. In exchange for his cooperation, prosecutors offered him a deal. If he pleaded guilty to a lesser charge and testified against Christine, they would recommend a reduced sentence. Christine, meanwhile, was facing the full weight of the evidence against her. The text message alone was devastating, but there was so much more. The blood evidence, Matthew's testimony, the sheer brutality of the crime that suggested deep personal rage, rather than a crime of opportunity. In December 2017, Christine made a decision. Rather than go to trial and risk spending the rest of her life in prison, she agreed to plead guilty to first-degree murder. There would be no trial, no opportunity for her to tell her side of the story to a jury. She would simply admit to killing her mother and accept whatever sentence the judge deemed appropriate. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for January 31st, 2018, at the McLean County Law and Justice Center in Bloomington. It would be an emotional day for everyone involved. The courtroom was packed on that winter day in 2018. Family members of both Teresa and Christine were there, along with members of the public and the media. Judge Robert Fright presided over the proceedings, and it was clear from his demeanor that this was a case that troubled him deeply. The prosecution, led by State's Attorney Jason Chambers, argued for a harsh sentence. They emphasized the premeditated nature of the crime, the text message showing Christine's intent, and the extraordinary brutality of the murder. They described how Teresa had been stabbed nearly a dozen times, strangled, and beaten. They argued that this was a cold, calculated, and brutal murder that deserved the maximum punishment. Christine's defense attorneys had a harder task. They didn't try to excuse what their client had done. How could they? Instead, they focused on the mitigating factors. Christine's young age, just 22 at the time of the murder, her troubled childhood, and the knowledge of the abuse her mother had suffered, which had somehow traumatized Christine as well. Her own struggles with addiction following the same path as Teresa. They painted a picture of a young woman who had been damaged by circumstances beyond her control, who had made a terrible choice in a moment of rage and fear. Before the judge pronounced sentence, Christine was given an opportunity to speak. She stood before the court, and according to those who were there, she broke down in tears. She expressed remorse for what she had done. She acknowledged the pain she had caused, not just to her mother, but to everyone who loved Teresa. She spoke of how she wished she could take it back, how she would give anything to undo what she had done. Judge Fright listened to everything. He reviewed all the evidence, considered all the arguments from both sides. He spoke about how he had searched for wisdom in trying to craft a fair sentence. He acknowledged the factors in Christine's favor: her youth, the unfortunate circumstances of her childhood, the fact that she had accepted responsibility by pleading guilty rather than putting everyone through a trial. He noted that Christine had shown what he believed were the first signs of genuine rehabilitation during the hearing. Her remorse seemed sincere, but then his tone hardened. "But nothing will take away what you did," he told Christine. He sentenced her to 40 years in the Illinois Department of Corrections. She would not be eligible for parole. The sentence meant that Christine would be 62 years old before she could even be considered for release. As the judge pronounced the sentence, Christine broke down completely. The weight of what she had done and the price she would pay for it seemed to crash down on her all at once. She was led from the courtroom in tears, beginning a journey that would take her to prison for the next 4 decades. Matthew Isbell, who had cooperated with investigators and testified against Christine, received a much lighter sentence as part of his plea deal. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison for his role in the murder. While still a substantial sentence, it was a fraction of what Christine received. A reflection of the fact that while he had been complicit in the crime, Christine was the driving force behind it. In the days following the sentencing, State's Attorney Jason Chambers released a statement. "For the people affected by this crime," he said, "the tragedy doesn't end." He was right. Teresa Pullman's family and friends had lost someone they cared about in the most horrific way imaginable. The fact that the killer was Teresa's own daughter only made the tragedy more profound. How do you process something like that? How do you grieve for someone whose life was taken by their own child? The case drew national attention. The television show Snapped on the Oxygen Network featured the murder of Teresa Pullman in their 28th season. The episode brought the case to a wider audience, people who were fascinated and horrified by the story of a daughter who killed her mother in such a brutal way. Journalists and true crime writers examined the case, trying to understand what had driven Christine to such a terrible act. Was it the resentment over being given up for adoption, Was it fear of being arrested for prostitution? Was it the culmination of years of anger and drug abuse? Or was it some combination of all these factors, a perfect storm of rage and desperation that led to murder? Psychologists and criminologists weighed in with their theories. Some pointed to the generational trauma, the way addiction and dysfunction had been passed down from Teresa's mother to Teresa to Christine, each generation damaged by the one before. Others focused on the adoption, arguing that Christine's feelings of abandonment had festered for years until they exploded in violence. Still others suggested that Christine's own substance abuse had impaired her judgment, made her capable of an act she might not have committed while sober. The truth, like most truths in cases like this, is probably more complex than any single explanation. Human behavior is rarely the result of just one factor. Christine's decision to kill her mother was likely the result of many things. Her genetics, her environment, her choices, her addictions, her anger, her fear, all of it came together on that night in July 2017, resulting in Teresa's death and Christine's imprisonment. The murder of Teresa Pullman is a story without winners. Teresa is dead, killed in a horrible way by her own daughter. Christine is in prison, her life essentially over before it really began. Matthew Isbell is also imprisoned, his future limited by the terrible choice he made to help his friend commit murder. Teresa's family has lost her. Christine's child has lost their mother. The ripples of that night in Funk's Grove spread out endlessly, touching countless lives. There's something particularly horrifying about murders committed by family members. We expect our families to be our safe harbor, the people who love us unconditionally. When that bond is broken, when a family member becomes a killer, it shakes us in a fundamental way. It makes us question everything we think we know about human nature and the ties that bind us together. The case also highlights the devastating impact of addiction and trauma across generations. Teresa grew up in dysfunction and addiction, which she passed on to Christine despite the adoption. Christine grew up with her own demons, which eventually led her to murder. It's a cycle that seems almost impossible to break, and the Pullman case is a tragic illustration of what can happen when that cycle isn't broken. Judge Fright, in his sentencing remarks, said that Christine had shown the first signs of rehabilitation. Perhaps in the decades she'll spend in prison, she'll continue on that path. Perhaps she'll find a way to come to terms with what she did, to understand the factors that led her to murder, and to truly heal from the trauma that shaped her life. Perhaps she'll emerge from prison one day, an old woman in her 60s, ready to rebuild what's left of her life. Or perhaps the damage is too deep, the trauma too profound, the weight of what she did too heavy to ever truly recover from. As for Teresa, she's buried now, her troubled life over. All that remains are memories and the questions that always surround sudden, violent death. What might her life have been like if she'd been born into a different family? If she'd never been introduced to drugs as a child? If she'd been able to break free from addiction and mental illness? We'll never know the answers to these questions. We can only look at what happened and try to understand. Try to learn something from this tragedy that might prevent similar tragedies in the future. The woods at Funk's Grove Nature Preserve are peaceful again now. Hikers walk the trails. Families enjoy picnics. Children play. The barricades that blocked off the crime scene are long gone. Nature has a way of reclaiming places touched by violence, of covering over the scars and moving on. But the memory of what happened there remains. On a summer night in 2017, in those woods, Teresa Pullman took her last breath. She was killed by the daughter she had given birth to 22 years earlier, the daughter she had given up to provide a better life. In a terrible irony, that daughter ended up taking her life in one of the most violent ways imaginable. It's a story of dysfunction and addiction, of generational trauma and terrible choices. It's a story of a mother and daughter who never really got the chance to know each other, whose relationship was poisoned from the start by circumstances neither of them could control. It's a story of how quickly violence can erupt, how a lifetime of pain and resentment can explode in a single night of brutality. And it's a story that reminds us of the importance of breaking cycles of trauma and addiction before they lead to tragedy. Because once the violence is done, once blood has been shed, there's no taking it back. There's only prison and grief and regret, and the long shadow that murder casts over everyone it touches. Teresa Pullman is gone. Christine Rausch is in prison. The story is over, except for the decades of consequences still to unfold. And in the quiet darkness of night, when we reflect on cases like this, we're left with one unavoidable truth. Sometimes the greatest tragedies are the ones that didn't have to happen, the ones that might have been prevented if just a few things had been different. This is the murder of Teresa Pullman, the true crime story without a happy ending, without redemption, without anything but loss and waste, and the terrible knowledge of what human beings can do to each other, even when they're supposed to love each other most. Sleep well, knowing that justice was served. Christine Rausch is behind bars for 40 years. Matthew Isbell is serving his sentence. Teresa Pullman, despite her troubled life, didn't deserve to die the way she did. No one does. And perhaps in telling her story, we honor her memory and remind ourselves of the value of every human life, no matter how troubled, no matter how broken. Rest in peace, Teresa. Your story has been told. Please, if this is your first time listening to one of our true crime stories, welcome to the channel where we explore these cases in a calm and respectful way. I also want to take a moment to appreciate my amazing subscribers who've been rocking with me. Thank you so much for your continued support. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from and the current time in your corner of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still here. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories for sleep. Now, let's move on to our second story. Story 2. Tonight, let me tell you a story about love, obsession, and a tragedy that no one saw coming except perhaps one person. On the morning of September 28th, 2020, Eva Benefield woke up to silence. Not the peaceful kind of silence that comes with a quiet Monday morning, but the unsettling absence of something that had become her daily ritual every single morning. For as long as she could remember, her father Doug sent her a Bible verse by text. It didn't matter where he was or what he was doing. The verse always came through like clockwork. A small reminder that someone was thinking of her, that someone cared. But that morning there was nothing. Just the empty glow of her phone screen and a growing knot of dread in her stomach. Eva was 20 years old, living on her own now, working her shifts and trying to navigate young adulthood without the presence of her mother, who had died suddenly just a few years before. Her father had been her anchor through that grief, taking on both parental roles with a tenderness that surprised everyone who knew him. Doug Benefield wasn't just her father, he was her best friend, her protector, the person who made sure she knew she was never alone. So when the Bible verse didn't come, Eva knew. She couldn't explain it, but somewhere deep in her gut, she knew something terrible had happened. She started calling. No answer. She sent text after text, each one more frantic than the last. Then she did what any 20-year-old in 2020 would do. She started Googling. Doug Benefield. Ashley Benefield. Florida man accident. The search terms felt absurd as she typed them, like she was living in someone else's nightmare. Later that day, her uncle texted her. When she called him back, her voice was already shaking. "What's wrong with my dad?" she asked. "There's been an accident," he said, and Eva, without hesitation, without even needing to hear the rest, said, "She killed him, didn't she?" "Yeah," her uncle replied quietly. "She shot him twice." Those were the first words out of Eva's mouth. Not confusion, not disbelief, just a horrifying certainty that the woman her father had married, the woman who had come into their lives like a whirlwind 4 years earlier, had finally done what Eva had feared all along. To understand how we got to that moment, to understand how a 60-year-old businessman ended up bleeding out on a suburban Florida floor while his young wife stood over him with a gun, we have to go back to August of 2016, to a political dinner in Florida, to the moment when Doug Benefield first laid eyes on Ashley Byers. Doug was 54 years old that summer. He was a consultant who worked with technology companies and defense contractors, a man who had built a successful career through methodical thinking and careful planning. He was deeply religious, conservative in his values, and still reeling from a loss that had shattered his world just 9 months earlier. His wife Renee had died suddenly. She was 56 years old, and Eva had been the one to find her. Eva had gone to her mother's house, couldn't get in through the front door, crawled through bushes to peer through the window, and saw her mother's silhouette in the darkness. A neighbor kicked in the door. Renee was gone, an undiagnosed heart ailment. an arterial blockage that had claimed her life without warning. In the aftermath, Doug had thrown himself into being there for Eva, who was only 15 at the time. He became both mother and father to her, the person she could come to with boy problems, school drama, anything. They had formed a bond forged in grief, and Doug was determined to make sure his daughter never felt alone. But by August 2016, Doug was lonely. He attended a Republican political dinner in Florida, one of those events where donors and volunteers gathered to talk strategy and rally support. 2016 presidential election was in full swing, and the energy was electric. That's where he met Ashley Byers. She was 24 years old, 30 years younger than Doug. She worked in Donald Trump's Sarasota campaign office, helping to galvanize the evangelical vote, working the rallies with an infectious energy that got crowds fired up. Videos from that time show her throwing items into the crowd, whipping up enthusiasm, her smile bright and her presence magnetic. Ashley had been a dancer with the Maryland Youth Ballet, sometimes featured in performances. She was well-trained, graceful, and according to those who saw her dance, genuinely talented. She'd also done some swimsuit modeling, though dance remained her true passion, and she was a gun enthusiast. The night she first met Doug, she had guns on her person and her purse in her bra. It was a detail that both fascinated and impressed him. The chemistry between them was instant. Doug felt like he'd been struck by a thunderbolt. Here was this beautiful, ambitious young woman who shared his conservative values, his love of guns, his faith. They bonded immediately. Doug left the country days later for a short business trip. By the time his plane was landing back in the United States, they were texting constantly, heart emojis flying back and forth. Within a week, they were saying, "I love you" to each other. Doug was a religious man, and his friends believe he wanted to marry Ashley before being intimate with her. So just 13 days after they met, Doug called his closest friend Trip Cormany, who happened to be an ordained Episcopal pastor. "Will you marry us?" Doug asked. Trip wasn't thrilled. He barely knew Ashley, but he was loyal to his friends, so he agreed to perform the ceremony. Doug invited almost no one to the wedding. He didn't tell his friends. He didn't tell his family, and he didn't tell Eva. Imagine being 15 years old, still processing the death of your mother, finally settling into a new normal with your grieving father, and then discovering he's gotten married to a woman you've never met, a woman who's only 9 years older than you. Eva was upstairs in their house when Doug called her down to talk to him and Ashley. She remembers thinking the only reason they'd need to talk to her about their relationship was if they'd gotten engaged. As soon as those words left her mouth, Doug said, "We're married." It was bewildering. Doug's cousin Tommy later said he would have talked Doug out of it. Eva certainly would have talked him out of it, but Doug had made his choice, and now his teenage daughter had to live with it. The early months of the marriage were chaotic. Doug encouraged Ashley to try and take on a motherly role with Eva, who was having none of it. The situation became even more complicated when Doug and Ashley allowed Eva's friend Sydney to move into the house. Sydney was having a rough time at home, and Doug wanted to help, but now there were 2 teenage girls and a new young wife, all under one roof. A combustible combination. During one heated argument with Ashley, Doug did something he would regret for the rest of his life. In a moment of rage and frustration, he discharged a gun into the ceiling of the house. It was, in his own words, "the dumbest thing I've ever done in my life." He was filled with regret, apologizing profusely, but the damage was done. Ashley now had concrete evidence of Doug's temper, of his unpredictability, and yet 2 days after the gun incident, Doug and Ashley threw themselves a formal wedding reception, this time with guests. It was as if they were determined to prove that everything was fine, that their whirlwind marriage was going to work despite the rocky start. They also forged ahead with Ashley's grand plan, creating a ballet company. The American National Ballet was going to be revolutionary. At least that was the idea. Ashley envisioned an inclusive company that would welcome dancers of every shade, color, and body type. A stark contrast to the often rigid and exclusive world of professional ballet. They hired a ballet master named Michael Wise to train the dancers. Ashley and Doug talked a big game about big money. $10 million, they said, secured from backers. They named their company boldly, as if it were already a national institution. Michael Wise was impressed by Doug at first. He seemed kind, serious, methodical, a businessman who knew how to get things done. He didn't know anything about ballet, but he was open about that. The plan was for Michael to work with Ashley to help her understand how a company should be run. Ashley struck Michael as young and ambitious, someone who hopefully would rise to the occasion. In the summer of 2017, the American National Ballet held auditions. Dancers came from all over, drawn by the promise of something different, something inclusive. Amina Hemsley, a black female dancer, saw it as an opportunity she'd been waiting for. Ballet had always been challenging for her. She didn't fit the traditional mold, and auditions at other companies had been discouraging. But the American National Ballet promised to be different. Athena Nikolakopoulos felt the same way. If you were in the ballet community, she explained, you knew there was a lot of broken systems that needed fixing. When she interviewed with Ashley, she was genuinely excited about the vision being presented. Dancer after dancer proudly posted to social media that they'd joined the A&B family. Some 40 dancers from all over the world began arriving in Charleston, South Carolina, that fall, ready to work with Ashley and bring her vision to life. But from the very first meeting, it became clear that something was wrong. Ashley wasn't there. Doug announced that she was bedridden with a difficult pregnancy and wouldn't be there for the first several months. The dancers were confused. They'd been promised a state-of-the-art facility in downtown Charleston. Instead, Michael Wise had to ask if they could use his facility because nothing else had been arranged. Paychecks were late or didn't arrive at all. Doug was scrambling, going to the bank to pull out cash from his own pocket to pay the dancers. It wasn't sustainable, and confidence in the company began to evaporate quickly. The dancers kept thinking that when Ashley came back, everything would be fixed. But Ashley wasn't coming back. At the end of August 2017, citing her difficult pregnancy, Ashley went back to Florida to live with her mother. Doug remained in Charleston, desperately trying to make the ballet work. But the rumblings about trouble in the marriage grew louder. Then, in September, while Doug was at an event for the ballet, Ashley and her mother drove from Florida to the house in Charleston. Ashley packed up her things and left Doug a scathing note about all the reasons she didn't want to be with him anymore. She called him possessive and controlling. She brought up the incident when he'd fired the gun into the ceiling. She said his behavior had left her fearful for her life and the safety of her unborn child. Doug was devastated. His cousin Tommy saw the look on his face when he read the note. His heart was broken, but Doug wasn't ready to give up. He sent Ashley text after text begging her to reconsider. I am on my knees and face before God asking you to forgive me, he wrote. Ashley was not in a forgiving mood. Instead, she decided to call the authorities. She told police that Doug had anger issues and recounted the day he fired his gun inside the house. Child Protective Services got involved. Investigators showed up at Eva's door, questioning whether Doug was a good father. Eva was furious. She kept having to repeat herself to strangers. My dad is a good dad. He's never done anything to hurt anyone. He wouldn't hurt anyone. Doug was subjected to a CPS investigation. He underwent a full psychological evaluation. The conclusion was clear. There was nothing wrong with him. He wasn't dangerous. He was ultimately cleared of all allegations. But the damage to his reputation and his relationship with Ashley continued to mount. By mid-October 2017, with Ashley refusing to return to Charleston, Doug was forced to make changes at the ballet company. Ashley was pushed out of leadership because there needed to be leadership, and she wasn't providing it. When Doug called to tell her, Michael Wise was in the room. He could hear Ashley screaming on the other end of the line. You took my ballet company away from me. New leaders were brought in. They made drastic changes. On October 23rd, a group of dancers were called into a meeting, told to sign non-disclosure agreements, and fired. Just like that, half of the company's dancers were gone. 2 days later, Ashley posted on the ballet's social media pages, I am completely devastated by what has been done. She wrote that the new leadership has destroyed all that we worked so hard to build. Within months, the American National Ballet was done. Doug was out more than $100,000, but the beautiful idea had gone up in smoke. But a new nightmare was just beginning. Ashley now had questions about Renee, Doug's first wife. How had she died, exactly? She texted Doug, "Wait, what did she die of again?" Doug explained, patiently, that Renee had died of a heart attack caused by a 75% artery blockage. The autopsy report was clear, but Ashley wasn't satisfied. "I thought I have heard you say something about medications or something. Like bad drugs?" It soon became clear where Ashley's mind was going. She told Doug's cousin Tommy that she thought Doug had poisoned Renee, even though Doug had been out of town when Renee died. Tommy was baffled. It was completely out of left field. The local police had closed the case in 2016 after receiving the coroner's report. There was no question about what had killed Renee, but Ashley had another shocking allegation. She told writer Alice Robb that as a dancer she'd always known her body well, and during her pregnancy she felt like she was more nauseous than she should have been. She believed Doug had been poisoning her. She pointed to the times Doug had brought her tea in bed when she was too sick to get up. Both of them were big tea fans. But now Ashley was convinced the tea had been laced with something. When Doug sent Ashley a birthday gift at the end of November 2017, a lovely teapot, teacups and saucers, and specialty tea for pregnant women, Ashley's suspicions only grew. She took the tea to the police department, claiming it was hazardous material and that it was how Doug was poisoning her. The police treated it as hazardous material, tested it, and determined there was nothing poisonous about it. It was just tea. Ashley also sent her hair to an independent lab for testing. The report showed higher than normal levels of aluminum, zinc, and other metals. But Doug's lawyer later pointed out that Ashley had gotten plenty of lab work done during her pregnancy, and her medical records from South Carolina showed that all her labs had come back normal. Still, Ashley believed she had been poisoned, and she believed her unborn baby had been exposed to heavy metals in utero. 3 weeks before her due date, without Doug knowing, Ashley checked herself into Tampa General Hospital. She told the hospital staff that she had been poisoned by her husband, that she had been held prisoner in Charleston, and that Doug was physically abusive and had been stalking her in Florida. With no way to verify if any of this was true, the hospital took precautions. They assigned Ashley a new name for her safety, Christine. 3 days later, the doctors performed a C-section. The baby girl named Emerson was born healthy, but Ashley continued to worry that her baby had been poisoned. For 26 consecutive days, Ashley brought Emerson to receive treatments in a hyperbaric chamber, a 12-person chamber designed to detox the body of heavy metals and toxins. Emerson was the youngest patient ever treated at that facility. She spent 40 hours inside the chamber, her tiny body half inside a plastic hood like a little ballerina. It took more than a month for the news that Ashley had given birth to reach Doug. When he finally found out, he learned that Emerson did not have his last name. Doug was not listed as the father on the original birth certificate. No one was. Ashley wanted to raise her daughter with her mother alone. She didn't want to co-parent, but Doug wanted to be part of his daughter's life. In September 2018, the Benefields squared off in a Bradenton, Florida courtroom. Doug wanted to see his daughter. Ashley was requesting an injunction to keep him far away. During the hearing, Doug's lawyer Stephanie Murphy questioned Ashley about her claims of poisoning. Ashley insisted she had been poisoned, that it was heartbreaking that someone she trusted would do such a thing. But after 2 days of testimony, the judge was not persuaded. She ruled, "There is not a single scintilla of credible evidence that Ms. Benefield has ever been poisoned or suffered from any illness of any poison." The ruling cleared the way for Doug to finally see his daughter. Days after the ruling, Doug and Ashley met outside the sheriff's office to exchange Emerson. To Stephanie Murphy's surprise, Ashley was suddenly very accommodating. She was cordial, even friendly. She handed the baby over to Doug, without any drama. And then Ashley suggested something that shocked everyone. Maybe the three of them, Doug, Ashley, and the baby, could spend time together. Maybe they could be a family. Doug agreed. He wanted to make the transition as easy as possible for Emerson, who barely knew him. For the better part of the next year, Ashley and their daughter seemed happy, at least according to Doug. Doug even moved to a nearby apartment in Florida to be close to them. Doug thought they were back together, that they were doing what they should have done from the beginning. Slowly getting to know each other, building a family. His lawyer Stephanie thought everything was going to be okay. But in August 2019, when Doug met Ashley to pick up Emerson, he noticed something that stopped him cold. An engagement ring on Ashley's finger. Doug hired a private investigator. The private eye confirmed what Doug feared. Ashley was seeing another man. In November 2019, Doug filed for divorce. Soon after, Ashley began lodging new complaints against Doug. She accused him of sexually abusing their daughter. She accused him of a litany of other things. Doug vehemently denied all of it. Authorities investigated and found no evidence to support Ashley's claims. In March 2020, Doug wrote an email to the sheriff's office accusing Ashley of having a split personality, and then in a move that shocked everyone who knew him, Doug did something that seemed completely insane. He announced that he and Ashley were going to try again to be a family. They were relocating to Maryland for a fresh start. Doug's friends and family were beside themselves. After everything Ashley had accused him of, after she'd claimed he was sexually abusing his own daughter, how could Doug possibly want to reconcile? Any viewer of this hour is going to ask. A journalist later said to Doug's cousin, "What did Doug need to see before he would say, 'Time out'? We're done." Tommy had no good answer. Doug was still believing he could rescue the marriage, that he could have a loving family. After somebody says you're sexually abusing your daughter, don't you cut and run? The journalist pressed. Don't you say I tried? I'm out. Yes, most people do, Trip Cormany agreed. But not Doug. Ashley was still presenting to Doug and to others that they were going to put everything back together again. And Doug, for reasons no one could understand, believed her. Trip Cormany said it best. There's nothing I can say that could possibly turn him around on this. He's going to do this if it kills him. On September 27, 2020, Doug Benefield was preparing to begin his new life. He was moving with Ashley, their young daughter Emerson, and Ashley's mother Alicia from Florida to Maryland. It was Sunday night. Doug was over at Ashley and Alicia's house, filling up a U-Haul with their belongings. Alicia decided to take Emerson for a walk down to the neighborhood park. It was a quiet evening in Lakewood Ranch, Florida, a peaceful suburban community where nothing bad ever seemed to happen. Ashley stayed behind with Doug. Soon after, a neighbor heard screaming and called 911. Then Ashley walked to a different neighbor's house. She was carrying her .45 caliber handgun. She told the neighbor, gun in hand, "I shot Doug in self-defense." The neighbor called 911. In the background of that call, you can hear Ashley sobbing. When the ambulance arrived, Doug was still breathing. He had been shot twice. Once in his right leg, once in his right arm. The bullet from his arm had traveled into his chest cavity. Police and EMTs worked desperately to save him. Doug lived for an hour, but there was too much damage. He was pronounced dead at Doctor's Hospital. Ashley was not arrested that night. Detectives began investigating her claim of self-defense. But Ashley didn't speak to detectives at all. She invoked her right to remain silent. Ashley's mother, Alicia, told detectives that she and her daughter were victims of domestic abuse, that they had been living in fear of Doug for 3.5 years. She claimed they had tried to get help, but nobody would help them. Ashley's lawyer told detectives that Ashley was creating an escape plan to get away from Doug once and for all. Ashley had a psychologist, 2 attorneys, and a burner phone. She had a safe location and a rental car set up. She was expected to implement the plan the very next day because she was very concerned that Doug was getting wind of it. But as detectives investigated, Ashley's claim of self-defense became increasingly problematic. Doug had no guns or weapons on his person or near him. Ashley had shot an unarmed man. And perhaps most damning of all, the forensic evidence determined that it did not appear Doug was facing Ashley when she began shooting. He had been shot from behind. In November 2020, Ashley Benefield was charged with second-degree murder. The arrest warrant noted that it appeared Ashley had exhausted all legal means of keeping Emerson away from Doug before the shooting. She pleaded not guilty. The case became a media sensation, dubbed the Black Swan murder trial because of Ashley's background as a ballerina. The story had everything: a whirlwind romance, a massive age gap, a failed ballet company, allegations of poisoning, custody battles, and finally deadly violence. Writer Alice Robb wrestled with the central question of the case. I don't know what Ashley believed. Was she genuinely afraid and just trying to protect her baby and save herself? Or was she trying to get Doug out of her life just out of spite, just because she hated him? Eva believed that part of Ashley wanted to believe Doug was a good guy, but there was also a part of her that was scared of him. I think that part took over, Eva said. She believed Ashley had made so many allegations against Doug that she started to believe them herself. A little too much. While awaiting trial, Ashley was out on bond. Her mother Alicia had custody of Emerson, and Ashley saw her daughter frequently. Eva, meanwhile, was left to process her grief alone. She took to TikTok, posting under the name Eva, Freak and Diva, using dark humor to cope with her pain. She joked that her brand was the girl with the dead parents. I use dark humor, she explained. I guess it's the way my brain's wired. But I'd rather not sit and sulk. I'd rather just make light of a situation. She cherished her time with Sully, the dog who had belonged to her father. She and Tommy went to the beach at Sullivan's Island, where Doug's ashes had been scattered, trying to find some measure of peace. I don't think I'm going to get peace until after the trial's over, Eva said. She had a recurring dream about her father. In it, they were in a big house, and Doug entered the room through a door. He said, "I've been in hiding, and I need you to help me." Eva ran with him toward a tunnel, and then she woke up. In the summer of 2024, nearly 4 years after Doug's death, Ashley Benefield's trial finally began. A small group appeared near the courthouse to support Ashley's claims of self-defense. When Ashley took the stand, she presented herself as a victim of years of abuse. She claimed Doug had been controlling and dangerous, that she had lived in fear. During her testimony, she became emotional, asking for a break at one point. When she returned, prosecutors noted that her eyes didn't appear puffy and her face looked the same as before she left the stand. They thought it was telling that her emotional display had been performance, not genuine grief. But Ashley's therapist, who spoke to the media with Ashley's permission, said that emotional expression varies widely from person to person. Not everyone cries the same way. The jury deliberated on the evidence. The failed ballet company, the poisoning allegations that were never substantiated, the custody battles, the accusations of abuse that were never proven, and the forensic evidence showing that Doug had been shot from behind while unarmed. On July 30th, 2024, the jury reached a verdict. Ashley Benefield was found guilty of manslaughter with a firearm, a lesser charge than the second-degree murder she'd been charged with. The jury apparently believed that while Ashley may have been genuinely afraid, the circumstances didn't justify her actions. In December 2024, Ashley was sentenced to 20 years in prison. So what really happened that night in September 2020? What was going through Ashley's mind when she pulled the trigger? Not once, but twice. Was she a victim who finally snapped after years of abuse? Or was she a manipulator who spun an elaborate web of lies to isolate Doug from his daughter, and when legal means failed, decided to eliminate him permanently? The truth, as it often does, probably lies somewhere in between. Ashley may have genuinely believed Doug was dangerous, that he had poisoned her, that he had killed his first wife. She may have constructed a narrative in her own mind over the years, one that grew more elaborate and more frightening with each retelling, until she couldn't separate reality from fear. Or perhaps she was simply a young woman who rushed into a marriage with a man she barely knew, quickly regretted it, and spent the next 4 years trying to extricate herself while keeping custody of her daughter. And when she realized Doug would always be part of her life as long as they shared a child, she made the decision to ensure he never would be. Doug Benefield was 60 years old when he died. He was a father who loved his daughter Eva fiercely, who tried to be there for her after her mother's death, who wanted nothing more than to be part of his youngest daughter Emerson's life. He was also a man who ignored every warning sign, who refused to give up on a marriage that was doomed from the start, who kept believing against all evidence that love could conquer the chaos. His best friend Tripp said it. He's gonna do this if it kills him. And tragically it did. Eva still goes to the beach at Sullivan's Island, where her father's ashes were scattered. She still thinks about Ashley all the time, wondering why. Why would Ashley take away her father, her best friend, knowing that Eva didn't have another parent? Emerson, Doug's youngest daughter, is growing up without knowing her father. She was only 2 years old when he died. Whatever memories she might have had of him will fade, replaced by stories told by others, stories that will be forever complicated by the circumstances of his death. The American National Ballet, the grand dream that brought Doug and Ashley together, is a distant memory now, a failed experiment that left dozens of dancers disappointed and one man bankrupt. And somewhere in a Florida prison, Ashley Benefield sits with 20 years ahead of her to think about the choices she made, the life she took, and the daughter she won't see grow up. The Case of the Black Swan, they called it. A story of a graceful dancer who became something darker, something dangerous. A story of a man who loved too much and trusted too deeply. A story that ended not on a stage but on the floor of a suburban home, with 2 gunshots that echoed through the lives of everyone they touched. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember, not all stories have happy endings. Some stories are just tragic from beginning to end. A series of choices that lead inexorably toward disaster, despite the best intentions of everyone involved. Doug Benefield wanted to save his marriage. He wanted to be a good father. He wanted to believe in second chances. And for that, he paid the ultimate price. Please, if you're enjoying these stories, don't forget to leave a comment. Let me know where you're listening from and what time it is in your corner of the world. And if you haven't already, be sure to like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now let's move on to our third story. Story 3. There are stories that stay with you long after you hear them. Stories that remind us of the fragility of innocence, and the darkness that can lurk in the most ordinary of places. This is one of those stories. Tonight we're going to walk through the events of January 2017 in Cleveland, Ohio, where a young girl's routine morning turned into a nightmare that would shake an entire community to its core. This is the story of Aliana DeFries. It was January 26, 2017. A Thursday. The kind of winter morning that Cleveland knows all too well. Cold gray, the sky heavy with clouds that promised nothing but more of the same. In a modest home in Cleveland, a 14-year-old girl named Aliana DeFries was getting ready for school. Aliana wasn't like other teenagers. She had a developmental disorder that made her see the world a little differently than her peers. While other kids her age were scrolling through social media, staying out late, testing boundaries, Aliana was content with simpler pleasures. She loved playing with her baby dolls. She adored taking care of her younger brother. She was gentle, trusting, and followed rules with the kind of dedication that made her mother, Danesha Cooper, never worry about where her daughter was. That morning, Aliana had an early class. She needed to catch the 6:45 a.m. bus on East 49th Street, just north of Kinsman Avenue. It was a route she knew well, one she'd taken countless times before. Danesha walked with her daughter in the early morning darkness, seeing her safely to the bus stop. They said their goodbyes. It was ordinary. It was routine. It was the last time Danesha would see her daughter alive. Aliana boarded the Regional Transit Authority bus right on schedule. She was wearing her school clothes, a black sweater, jeans, a training bra underneath. She carried herself with the quiet determination of a girl who knew exactly where she was supposed to be. The bus pulled away from the curb, and Danesha went back home, thinking about the day ahead, never imagining that by afternoon her world would be irrevocably shattered. The bus ride was uneventful. Aliana sat, perhaps looking out the window at the passing streets of Cleveland, perhaps thinking about school, about her dolls waiting at home, about her brother. The bus made its usual stops, picking up early morning commuters, workers heading to their shifts, students like Aliana heading to class. At East 93rd and Kinsman Avenue, Aliana got off the bus. This was her transfer point. She needed to switch lines here to get to E-Prep, her school. It should have been simple. Get off one bus, wait for the next, get on, continue to school. She'd done it dozens of times before, but something went wrong. Aliana never got on that second bus. At 4 o'clock that afternoon, Danesha Cooper was expecting to hear the front door open. She was expecting to see her daughter walk through it, ready to tell her about her day, ready to play with her dolls, ready to help with her little brother. But 4 o'clock came and went. The door stayed closed. 4:15. 4:30. The worry began to creep in, that mother's intuition that something wasn't right. By 4:30, Danesha picked up the phone and called the school. The conversation was brief, but its impact was devastating. Aliana never showed up for classes that day. The school's words hit Danesha like a physical blow. Her daughter hadn't been at school all day long, while Danesha thought Aliana was safe in her classroom, learning, eating lunch, being exactly where she was supposed to be. Aliana had been nowhere, or rather she had been somewhere, but not where she should have been. Danesha's mind raced. Aliana would never just skip school. She wouldn't wander off. She didn't have friends she'd go visit without permission. She was a creature of routine, of rules, of doing exactly what was expected of her. If she wasn't at school, something was terribly, terribly wrong. But here's the cruel mathematics of missing persons cases. Time matters. Every minute counts. Every hour that passes decreases the likelihood of a safe return. And because the school never called to say Aliana was absent, despite her perfect attendance record, despite never missing a day without prior notice, Dinesha didn't know her daughter was missing until 4 p.m. The search for Aliana didn't begin until 10 hours after she was last seen. 10 hours. In a missing child case. That's an eternity. The Cleveland Police Department moved quickly once the report was filed. They knew the statistics. They knew what those 10 lost hours might mean. They immediately began pulling surveillance footage from businesses in the area, trying to piece together Aliana's movements that morning. The footage told a story, but it was an incomplete one. There was Aliana boarding the bus at 6:45 a.m. Just as her mother said, there she was on the bus, sitting quietly, looking out the window. There she was getting off at East 93rd and Kinsman Avenue to make her transfer. And then there was something else. Someone else. A man. On the surveillance footage, investigators watched as this man walked up and down the street. He seemed to be waiting, looking. When Aliana appeared in the frame, something happened. She took 2 steps backward. It was a subtle movement, but it was there. A moment of hesitation, a moment of uncertainty. Perhaps she sensed something. Perhaps she felt that primitive warning system that tells us when something isn't right. But then she continued walking, passing the man. And on the footage, clear as day, they watched him turn and follow her. The police now had a person of interest. They needed to identify him. They needed to find him. And they needed to find Aliana. For 3 days, Cleveland held its breath. Aliana's face was everywhere on the news, on social media, on flyers posted on telephone poles and in-store windows. Her mother gave tearful interviews, pleading for anyone with information to come forward. The community searched. Volunteers walked the streets, calling Aliana's name, looking in alleys and vacant lots and any place a frightened teenager might hide. But Cleveland has a problem that many post-industrial American cities share. Abandoned houses, blocks of them in some neighborhoods, empty shells of homes where families once lived, now left to decay, their windows boarded up, their doors hanging loose on broken hinges. They're havens for squatters, for drug users, for people who don't want to be found. And sometimes they're places where terrible things happen in the dark. On January 29th, 3 days after Aliana was reported missing, police were systematically searching the area around East 93rd and Kinsman. They came to an abandoned house on Fuller Avenue. The house had no electricity, no running water. It had been empty for years, but something made them take a closer look. The door was open. The officers entered, bringing lights with them because the interior was pitch black, and immediately they knew something was wrong. There were footprints on the floor, bloody footprints, smears of blood on the walls, a trail of blood leading from the hallway toward a bedroom. The bedroom door was closed. One of the officers kicked it in, and there, in the corner of that dark, cold bedroom, they found Aliana DeFries. What the police found in that abandoned house was so brutal, so savage, that even seasoned homicide detectives struggled to process it. This wasn't just a murder. This was torture. This was sustained, deliberate violence inflicted over hours. Aliana's naked body lay in a pool of blood. The amount of blood in that room told investigators that this is where she died, that she'd been here the entire time, from the morning she disappeared until the moment her life finally ended. Scattered around the room were items that painted a picture of what happened. A training bra, a ripped black school sweater, a black shoe, a ripped condom wrapper, and tools. A Black & Decker drill, a Phillips head screwdriver, a nut driver, a box cutter, a hammer. These weren't weapons that someone brought, intending to kill. These were tools found in the house, implements of construction and repair, now used for destruction and horror. The medical examiner who arrived at the scene that day would later testify that in all their years of experience, they'd rarely seen injuries this extensive. Aliana had been beaten. She'd been raped. She'd been tortured with the tools found near her body. She'd been stabbed repeatedly with a box cutter. So many slash wounds to her neck that it was impossible to count them all. The drill had been used to inflict 4 puncture wounds to her cheek. One wound to her forehead was so severe it had dislodged her right eyeball from its socket. But perhaps the most heartbreaking detail was this. Many of the wounds showed signs of healing. That meant Aliana had been alive for hours after these injuries were inflicted. She'd survived the initial attack. She'd laid in that dark room in pain, probably in shock, for hours before she finally died. The medical examiner couldn't determine a specific cause of death because there were too many catastrophic injuries. The official determination was simply beaten and stabbed to death. With Aliana's body found, the investigation shifted. This was no longer a missing person case. This was a homicide, and the clock was ticking to identify the man from the surveillance footage. It didn't take long. In the age of social media and community policing, someone recognized him. His name was Christopher Whitaker. He was 44 years old. He was from South Euclid, a nearby suburb, and crucially, he was a registered sex offender. Police brought Christopher in for questioning. He sat across from detectives in an interview room and told them his story. He'd heard about Aliana from the news. He said he'd never met her. On the day she disappeared, he claimed he'd been doing drywall work on some houses in the area. The detectives asked him about the abandoned house on Fuller Avenue. Had he ever been there? Yes, Christopher admitted. He'd been there a few days before Aliana went missing. He and another guy, he called him Boogie, had gone to the house to scrap some metal. They'd taken a hot water heater, some copper piping. Just trying to make a few bucks, he explained. The detectives nodded. They let him talk. And then they told him what they knew. His DNA was found in that house. His DNA was found on Aliana's body. His semen was found inside Aliana's body. How could that be, they asked, if he'd never met her? Christopher's story changed. He told the detectives, I'm a crackhead. I get high and do stupid shit for money. He claimed that he and 2 other men got high in the abandoned house. At first he said he didn't touch Aliana. He just masturbated. Then his story changed again. He claimed he'd had consensual sex with Aliana. Consensual sex. With a 14-year-old girl with a developmental disorder who'd been abducted on her way to school. The detectives asked for water at some point during the interrogation. Christopher looked at them and said, I just want to die right now. As the investigation continued, a picture emerged of who Christopher Whitaker really was. And it was chilling. Because all the warning signs had been there. All the red flags had been waving. The system had known about Christopher Whitaker. Had marked him as dangerous. And yet he'd been free to walk the streets that morning when Aliana got off the bus. In 2005, 12 years before Aliana's murder, Christopher had committed another violent crime. He targeted a 45-year-old woman who lived in the Trinity Towers apartment complex on Rockside Road in Bedford Heights. Throughout one night, he called her repeatedly, asking if he could use her restroom. Finally, perhaps worn down by his persistence, perhaps feeling sorry for him, she let him in. It was a decision she'd regret. Christopher choked her unconscious. While she was unconscious, he sexually assaulted her. Then he stabbed her twice in the neck with a pair of scissors. She survived. Christopher was caught, charged, convicted. He became a registered sex offender. He went to prison, but then he got out. And on January 26, 2017, Christopher Whitaker was a free man, walking the streets of Cleveland, when a 14-year-old girl got off the bus to transfer to another line. Christopher Whitaker's trial began on February 1, 2018, just over a year after Aliana's death. The courtroom was packed. Aliana's family was there, seeking justice. The media was there, documenting every moment. And Christopher was there, sitting at the defense table, facing the full weight of what he'd done. The prosecution's case was straightforward and devastating. This was, they argued, a violent and premeditated murder that deserved nothing less than the death penalty. Christopher had spotted Aliana at the bus stop. He'd followed her, he'd abducted her, and taken her to the abandoned house where he knew they wouldn't be disturbed. And there he'd subjected her to hours of rape, torture, and ultimately murder. Detective Corlin took the stand and described the house where Aliana's body was found. You could tell there was violent trauma in that house. He testified because of the bloodstains and splatters in various places throughout the structure. The trail of blood that led to the bedroom, the closed door that had to be kicked in. The small body in the corner, lying in a pool of her own blood. The medical examiner's testimony was clinical, but horrifying. They described each injury in detail. They showed photographs. They explained how the drill marks on Aliana's face matched the Black & Decker drill found near her body, how the slash wounds matched the box cutter, how the puncture wounds matched the screwdriver and nut driver. Prosecutor Mahmoud held up each tool for the jury to see: the drill, the screwdriver, the box cutter, the hammer. He showed them photographs of Aliana's injuries. He made sure they understood that these weren't quick wounds, that Aliana had suffered for hours before death finally took her. The defense attorney, Thomas Shaughnessy, stood up when it was his turn, and he shocked the courtroom by announcing that Christopher didn't contest the charges. They would call no witnesses in his defense. Because there was no defense, Christopher Whitaker was guilty, and everyone in that courtroom knew it. The defense's only hope was to save Christopher from the death penalty. They presented evidence of his drug use, his troubled childhood, his mental health issues. They argued that while his crimes were terrible, he was less able to control his impulses, less responsible for his actions because of his addiction and psychological problems. The jury deliberated for 6 hours. When they returned, they found Christopher Whitaker guilty on all 10 charges: kidnapping, rape, aggravated murder, aggravated burglary, tampering with evidence, and offenses against a human corpse. And they recommended death. Judge Carolyn Friedland could have overruled the jury's recommendation. She could have sentenced Christopher to life in prison instead, but she agreed with the jury. In her sentencing statement, she said, "The circumstances that Christopher's attorneys presented to convince jurors to spare his life pale in comparison to the barbarity of the evidence of what he did to the girl." Christopher Whitaker was sentenced to death, along with an additional 48 years for the other convictions. After the sentence was handed down, Aliana's mother, Dinesha Cooper, gave a statement. Her words were raw with grief and anger. "I appreciate the jury for making their judgment and recommendation, but death is too good for him, and I won't believe he has any remorse until he suffers like my daughter suffered. His apology means nothing to me." It was a sentiment that many in Cleveland shared, because the question that haunted everyone was, how did this happen? How was a registered sex offender, a man who'd already violently attacked and sexually assaulted one woman, free to abduct and murder a 14-year-old girl? The answer was systemic failure at multiple levels. The school that never called when Aliana didn't show up for class. The juvenile justice and parole system that released a violent offender. The city that left so many abandoned houses standing, empty and dark, perfect places for crimes to be committed unseen. In 2019, 2 years after Aliana's death, her parents filed a wrongful death lawsuit against Cleveland Metropolitan School District and the city of Cleveland. The lawsuit argued that the school district breached its duty by failing to notify Dinesha that Aliana was absent. If they'd called at the start of the school day, the search could have begun immediately, not 10 hours later. The lawsuit also accused the city of failing to monitor and prevent illicit activities in abandoned properties, including the house on Fuller Avenue where Aliana was murdered. In January 2022, the family reached a settlement with the school district and the city for $1 million. But no amount of money could bring Aliana back. Out of tragedy sometimes comes change. In response to Aliana's death, Ohio lawmakers passed a bill called Aliana's Alert. The law requires all schools to call parents within 2 hours of the start of the school day if their child is absent. It's a simple requirement, really. A phone call, 2 hours. But it's a requirement that might have saved Aliana's life. If the school had called Danisha at 8 a.m. or 9 a.m. to say Aliana never showed up, the police could have begun searching immediately. They could have reviewed the surveillance footage while Aliana was still alive. Those lost 10 hours might have been the difference between life and death. Aliana's Alert is her legacy. It's a way of ensuring that no other parent has to wait until 4 p.m. to discover their child never made it to school. It's a small comfort to a family that lost everything, but it's something. Christopher Whitaker's case didn't end with his sentencing. In October 2021, his attorneys appealed to the Ohio Supreme Court, asking that his sentence be changed from death to life without parole. Interestingly, Aliana's father, Damon DeFries, said he was okay with that change. Perhaps the idea of Christopher sitting in a prison cell for the rest of his life, with no hope of ever being free, was a more fitting punishment than a quick death. But the Ohio Supreme Court disagreed. In 2024, the court unanimously upheld Christopher Whitaker's death sentence. As of today, he remains on death row in Ohio, awaiting execution. The abandoned house on Fuller Avenue where Aliana was murdered has since been demolished. The lot sits empty now, just another vacant space in a city with too many of them. When we tell true crime stories, it's easy to focus on the horror, on the violence, on the evil that people are capable of committing. But it's important to remember the victim is more than just a victim. Aliana DeFries was a person. She was a daughter who loved her mother, a sister who cared for her younger brother, a student who never missed school, a girl who played with baby dolls and saw the world through eyes that were trusting and gentle. She was 14 years old. She had her whole life ahead of her. She should have gone to high school, graduated, maybe gone to college or learned a trade. She should have fallen in love, maybe had children of her own. She should have grown old. Instead, her life ended in a dark room, in an abandoned house on Fuller Avenue, because she had the misfortune of getting off a bus at the same moment a predator was looking for prey. Every year on January 26th, Aliana's family remembers her. They've created foundations in her name. They work to help other families, to support causes she would have cared about. They've turned their grief into action, their loss into a mission to prevent other families from experiencing what they've experienced. Aliana's grandmother, speaking after Christopher's conviction, said something that resonates. "I can see the evil that's in him, and we have to tell everybody, this is what evil looks like." Evil doesn't always look like a monster. Sometimes it looks like an ordinary man walking down an ordinary street on an ordinary Thursday morning in Cleveland. Sometimes it's waiting at a bus stop. Sometimes it's a registered sex offender who the system released back into society despite knowing what he was capable of. The murder of Aliana DeFries is a story about many things. It's about innocence stolen. It's about a predator who was allowed to hunt again. It's about institutional failures and missed opportunities and the preciousness of time. It's about a mother who sent her daughter to school one morning and never saw her alive again. But most of all, it's about a 14-year-old girl who deserved so much better than what she got, who deserved to be safe on her way to school, who deserved adults and systems that protected her instead of failing her. We tell these stories not to sensationalize tragedy, but to remember, to learn, to do better. Aliana's alert exists because Aliana doesn't anymore. It's a small piece of legislation, but it matters. It means that in Ohio, parents now get a phone call within 2 hours if their child doesn't show up to school. It's too late for Aliana. But maybe, somewhere, someday, that phone call will come in time to save another child. And if it does, Aliana DeFries' name will mean something beyond the tragedy of her death. It will mean protection, safety, a second chance that she never got. Christopher Whitaker took Aliana's life on January 26, 2017. But he couldn't take her impact. He couldn't erase her memory. He couldn't stop her family from fighting for change. And he couldn't prevent her story from being told, remembered, and used to protect others. That Thursday morning in Cleveland started like any other. A girl got on a bus to go to school. She should have made it. She should have had a normal day of classes and lunch and homework. She should have come home at 4 p.m. and played with her dolls and helped with her brother. Instead, her story became a reminder of how fragile safety is, how quickly an ordinary moment can become a nightmare, and how important it is to have systems in place to protect our most vulnerable. Rest in peace, Aliana DeFries. You deserved so much better. Your story matters. Your life mattered. And the changes made in your name will help protect other children for years to come. Please, I'm just putting it out there. If you're still awake and listening, drop a comment. Let me know where you're tuning in from, the time in your part of the world, or just say something to let me know you're still with me. And of course, if you haven't already, like this video and subscribe so you don't miss the next true crime story for sleep. Now, let's move on to our fourth story. Story 4. In the quiet town of Minden, Nevada, nestled in the Carson Valley beneath the Sierra Nevada mountains, February 21st, 2008 began like any other winter night. The air was crisp and still, with most residents settling into their homes as darkness fell across the valley. For Ben Oxley, a 36-year-old air conditioning repairman, it would be his last evening alive. Ben had found happiness again after a difficult divorce. 2 years earlier, he had married Melissa, a woman who brought light back into his life after a bitter separation from his first wife, Dawn. The couple lived in a modest home in the Wild Horse subdivision, where Ben was building a new chapter of his life alongside his beloved 6-year-old daughter, Alyssa, from his previous marriage. That Thursday evening unfolded with ordinary simplicity. Ben returned home from work, tired from another day of fixing heating and cooling systems throughout the valley. The February air carried winter's last breath, and he was looking forward to the weekend ahead. After dinner and some quiet time with his family, Ben and Melissa retired to their bedroom shortly after 10 o'clock. The house settled into its nighttime rhythm. Outside, the Nevada desert stretched endlessly under a canopy of stars, while inside, the family drifted toward sleep. Ben, exhausted from his physical work, fell asleep quickly beside his wife. Melissa, too, found herself slipping into slumber, unaware that in just 2 hours their peaceful world would be shattered forever. At approximately 12:30 in the morning, as the clock moved past midnight into February 22nd, a figure approached the Oxley home. The neighborhood was wrapped in darkness, with most windows showing no signs of life. Streetlights cast long shadows across the quiet residential streets, and the only sounds were the occasional whisper of wind through the desert sage. The intruder knew exactly where to go. This wasn't a random break-in or a crime of opportunity. Someone had been planning this moment, studying the house, knowing the layout, understanding when the family would be most vulnerable. The person moved with purpose through the darkness, carrying a 12-gauge shotgun. Inside the bedroom, Ben and Melissa slept peacefully, completely unaware of the danger that was now just feet away from their bed. The room was dark and quiet, filled only with the soft sounds of their breathing. Ben lay on his side, his body relaxed in deep sleep after another long day of honest work. Then in an instant that would forever divide their lives into before and after, the silence was obliterated by a thunderous boom that seemed to shake the very foundations of the house. Melissa jolted awake, her heart hammering in her chest. The sound had been so loud, so violent, that for a moment she couldn't comprehend what had happened. Was it thunder? Had something fallen? Her mind, still foggy with sleep, struggled to make sense of the noise that had torn her from her dreams. But as her eyes adjusted to the darkness and her senses began to clear, Melissa realized something was terribly wrong. Ben wasn't moving. The man who had been sleeping peacefully beside her just moments before now lay motionless. And in the dim light filtering through their bedroom window, she could see something dark spreading across the sheets. "Ben?" she whispered, her voice barely audible in the ringing silence that followed the explosion of sound. "Ben?" There was no response. No movement. No sign of life. The shotgun blast had been fired at close range, instantly killing Ben as he slept. The pellets had struck him in the chest and head, ending his life in a matter of seconds. He never woke up, never had a chance to defend himself or even understand what was happening. One moment he was dreaming, the next he was gone. Melissa's screams pierced the night as the full horror of the situation crashed over her. Her husband had been murdered right beside her, while she slept just inches away. The killer had been so close that she could have reached out and touched them, yet she had never woken up until it was too late. Within minutes, the Douglas County Sheriff's Office received a frantic 911 call. Deputies raced through the empty streets of Minden, their sirens cutting through the desert night as they rushed to what they initially assumed might be a home invasion gone wrong. Detective Sergeant Ron Elgies was among the first responders to arrive at the scene, a veteran investigator with years of experience in violent crimes. Elgies immediately began assessing the situation. What he found was puzzling from the very beginning. The house showed no signs of forced entry. Nothing appeared to be stolen or disturbed. This wasn't a robbery that had escalated to murder. The killer had entered the home, gone straight to the bedroom, executed Ben Oxley, and left. It was cold, calculated, and deeply personal, as dawn broke over the Carson Valley. The Oxley home was transformed into a crime scene. Yellow tape fluttered in the morning breeze, as investigators combed through every inch of the property, searching for clues that might lead them to Ben's killer. The most obvious question haunted everyone involved in the investigation. Who would want Ben Oxley dead? By all accounts, he was a hard-working, well-liked man who had turned his life around after a difficult divorce. He had no enemies that anyone knew of, no debts to dangerous people, no involvement in anything that would make him a target for this kind of violence. But as Detective Elgies began digging deeper into Ben's life, A complicated picture began to emerge. The divorce from his first wife, Dawn, had been anything but amicable. There had been bitter custody battles over their daughter Alyssa, financial disputes, and a history of domestic incidents that painted a picture of a relationship that had ended in anger and resentment. Dawn Oxley, now Dawn Oxley again, after remarrying and taking back her maiden name, had moved on with a new boyfriend named James Matlin. At 21 years old, Matlin was significantly younger than Dawn, and those who knew him described him as easily influenced and eager to please the older woman he had fallen in love with. The custody arrangement between Ben and Dawn had been a constant source of tension. Ben had fought hard for time with his daughter Alyssa, whom he adored above all else. The little girl was the light of his life, and he had worked to build a stable home where she could thrive during his visitation periods. Dawn, however, had made it clear that she resented Ben's continued presence in her life. Friends and family members would later testify that she had spoken openly about wishing he would just disappear, about how much easier her life would be if Ben was no longer part of the picture. As the investigation progressed, Detective LJS found himself focusing more and more on the possibility that this was not a random crime, but rather a murder that had grown out of the toxic dynamics of a failed marriage and a bitter custody dispute. However, there was another suspect who seemed even more likely, Melissa Oxley, Ben's current wife. From a purely statistical standpoint, spouses are often the first suspects in domestic homicides. Melissa had been sleeping right next to Ben when he was killed, yet she claimed she had slept through the intruder, entering their home, approaching their bed, and positioning themselves to fire the fatal shot. To some investigators, her story seemed implausible. Moreover, Melissa stood to inherit Ben's life insurance policy, and there were whispers that their marriage had not been as happy as it appeared on the surface. Some of Ben's family members found it difficult to believe that someone could sleep through such a violent attack happening just inches away. For months, Melissa found herself living under a cloud of suspicion. While she grieved the loss of her husband, she also had to endure the scrutiny of investigators who wondered if she had orchestrated his murder. The stress was overwhelming, and she found herself isolated from some of Ben's family members who couldn't shake their doubts about her innocence. But Detective Eljiz, while keeping an open mind about all possibilities, began to focus his attention elsewhere. Something about the crime scene didn't fit with the theory that Melissa was the killer. The angle of the shotgun blast, the lack of gunshot residue on her hands or clothing, the genuine shock and grief she displayed. It all pointed to someone else being responsible. As months passed without an arrest, the case began to grow cold. Ben's murder dominated local news coverage for a while, but eventually other stories took precedence, and the investigation seemed to stall. But Detective L just refused to give up. He continued working the case, re-interviewing witnesses, following up on tips, and slowly building a more complete picture of the events leading up to that terrible night in February. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: Dawn Oxley's own teenage son from a previous relationship. 16-year-old Devin had been living in Dawn and James's household, and over time he had become increasingly uncomfortable with conversations he had overheard between his mother and her boyfriend. In hushed discussions that they thought no one else could hear, Dawn had allegedly told James that she wanted Ben dead, that her life would be so much better if her ex-husband was out of the picture permanently. At first, Devin thought these were just the angry words of a bitter ex-wife, venting her frustrations. But as the months passed and Ben's murder remained unsolved, the teenager began to wonder if his mother and James had been discussing something more serious than just wishful thinking. The weight of this knowledge became unbearable for Devin. He was just a kid, trying to navigate his own teenage problems while carrying the burden of suspecting that his mother might be involved in murder. Eventually, the pressure became too much, and he reached out to law enforcement. Detective Eljaves listened carefully as Devin described the conversations he had overheard. The teenager was clearly frightened and conflicted. He loved his mother, but he also knew that if she was involved in Ben's death, justice needed to be served. This information gave Eljaves the lead he had been hoping for, but it was still largely circumstantial. He needed more evidence, more concrete proof of Dawn and James's involvement in the murder. The detective began focusing his investigation more intensively on the couple. He learned that James Matlin had a history of wanting to please Dawn, of doing whatever it took to make her happy. Friends described him as someone who was completely devoted to her, someone who would do anything she asked without question. As the investigation continued, more pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Cell phone records showed that Dawn and James had been in the vicinity of Ben's house on the night of the murder. Witnesses came forward to say they had seen a vehicle matching the description of James's car in the Wild Horse subdivision around the time of the shooting. But the most compelling evidence came from an unlikely witness, 6-year-old Alyssa Oxley, Ben's daughter. Initially, investigators had been reluctant to interview such a young child about such a traumatic event. But as the case dragged on and other leads failed to produce enough evidence for an arrest, Detective LJs realized that Alyssa might hold the key to solving her father's murder. Working with child psychologists and using age-appropriate questioning techniques, investigators slowly began to uncover what Alyssa had seen and heard on the night her father died. The little girl's testimony was heartbreaking in its innocence and devastating in its implications. She described seeing her mother, Dawn, at the house that night, something that Dawn had never mentioned to investigators. Alyssa talked about hearing voices she recognized, about seeing figures in the darkness that she initially thought were part of a bad dream. Most significantly, Alyssa was able to identify James Matlian as someone who had been at the house that night. Her description of events, while filtered through the perception of a traumatized 6-year-old, provided crucial corroborating evidence for the case that Detective Uljes was building. The investigation revealed a plan that was as cold-blooded as it was calculating. According to the evidence that emerged, Dawn had allegedly convinced James to murder not just Ben, but also Melissa, eliminating both obstacles to her gaining full custody of Alyssa and access to any financial benefits that might result from Ben's death. James, completely devoted to Dawn and eager to solve what he saw as her problems, had reportedly agreed to the plan. On the night of February 21st, Dawn had allegedly accompanied him to Ben's house, where James entered through an unlocked door and made his way to the bedroom where Ben and Melissa slept. The original plan, according to investigators, was for James to kill both Ben and Melissa. But when he saw Melissa sleeping peacefully beside Ben, something stopped him. Whether it was conscience, fear, or simply the reality of what he was about to do, James couldn't bring himself to murder an innocent woman who had done nothing wrong. Instead, he fired a single fatal shot at Ben, then fled the scene with Dawn, leaving Melissa alive to discover the horror of what had happened. But the plan immediately began to unravel. Dawn hadn't anticipated that investigators would be as thorough as Detective Elgis proved to be. She hadn't expected that her own son would eventually come forward with damaging information. She certainly hadn't considered that little Alyssa might be a witness to her father's murder. The arrest, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic compared to the years of investigation that had led to it. In June 2010, more than 2 years after Ben's murder, James Matlian was taken into custody and charged with first-degree murder. James initially maintained his innocence, but as the evidence mounted against him, his resolve began to crumble, faced with the prospect of a death penalty trial. And the weight of all the evidence that Detective Elges had meticulously gathered, James eventually decided to tell the truth about what had happened that night. His confession was detailed and chilling. He described how Dawn had repeatedly talked about wanting Ben dead, how she had convinced him that killing her ex-husband was the only way they could be happy together. He admitted to entering Ben's home with the intention of committing murder, and he acknowledged that the plan had originally included killing Melissa as well. However, James also made it clear that he viewed himself as Dawn's tool rather than the mastermind of the plot. He claimed that Dawn had orchestrated the entire plan, that she had been the driving force behind the decision to murder Ben. Dawn, meanwhile, found herself in an increasingly precarious position. Her son's testimony, combined with James's confession and the physical evidence linking her to the crime scene, painted a picture of a woman who had manipulated her younger boyfriend into committing murder for her own benefit. In a move that would prove controversial, prosecutors offered Dawn immunity from murder charges in exchange for her testimony against James. The deal was struck in February 2011, and Dawn agreed to tell the truth about her involvement in the planning and execution of Ben's murder. Her testimony during James's trial was devastating. She admitted to discussing killing Ben with James, acknowledged being present on the night of the murder, and confirmed many of the details that investigators had pieced together over the years of investigation. However, Dawn portrayed herself as a reluctant participant who had been swept up in James's obsession with solving her problems through violence. She claimed that while she had expressed wishes that Ben was dead, she had never seriously intended for those wishes to be acted upon. This version of events conflicted sharply with James's account, in which he portrayed Dawn as the mastermind who had convinced him to commit murder. The truth, as often happens in such cases, probably lay somewhere in between the two extremes. What was clear was that both Dawn and James bore responsibility for Ben's death. Whether Dawn was the calculating manipulator that James described, or the reluctant participant that she claimed to be, Her actions had led directly to the murder of her ex-husband. In December 2011, James Matlean pleaded guilty to first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. The plea deal spared him from the death penalty, but ensured that he would spend the rest of his life in prison. At his sentencing hearing in March 2012, James finally took full responsibility for his actions. He acknowledged the pain he had caused to Ben's family, particularly little Alyssa, who had lost her father because of his choices. "I'm taking full responsibility for what I did," James said during his sentencing. But he also added, "Dawn needs to take full responsibility for what she did." The case had taken a tremendous toll on everyone involved. Alyssa Oxley had not only lost her husband in the most violent way imaginable, but had also endured years of suspicion and investigation. Ben's family struggled to understand how their loved one could have been taken from them in such a senseless way. But perhaps no one was affected more profoundly than Alyssa Oxley. The little girl who had been just 6 years old when her father was murdered had been forced to relive the trauma of that night through interviews with investigators and testimony in court. She had lost not only her father, but also her sense of security and innocence. However, in one of the most remarkable aspects of this tragic story, Alyssa demonstrated a maturity and compassion that was extraordinary for someone so young. During James's sentencing hearing, she asked to speak with her father's killer. In a private meeting, the then 10-year-old girl told James that she had decided to forgive him, despite everything he had taken from her, despite the pain and trauma he had caused. Alyssa found the strength to offer forgiveness. "I told him that I decided to forgive him, and that I wanted him to have hope," she later recalled. This act of grace from such a young person provided a powerful example of the possibility for healing and redemption, even in the aftermath of the most terrible crimes. James Matlean was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He remains incarcerated in Nevada, serving his sentence for the murder of Ben Oxley. He will never be eligible for release, and he will spend the rest of his life paying for the choices he made on that February night in 2008. Dawn Oxley, having received immunity for her testimony against James, was never charged with murder in connection with Ben's death. However, she was sentenced to 90 months in federal prison on separate drug charges that were unrelated to her ex-husband's murder. The case officially closed with James's conviction, but the questions it raised about domestic violence, custody disputes, and the lengths to which some people will go to eliminate obstacles from their lives continue to resonate. Detective Sergeant Ron Elges, whose meticulous investigation had finally brought justice for Ben Oxley, reflected on the case as one of the most challenging of his career. The complexity of the relationships involved, the years of painstaking evidence gathering, and the emotional toll of working with witnesses like young Alyssa made it a case that would stay with him forever. For Melissa Oxley, the resolution of the case brought some measure of closure, but it couldn't bring back her husband or restore the life they'd been building together. She had to rebuild her world from scratch, carrying the memories of that terrible night, but also the knowledge that justice had finally been served. The murder of Ben Oxley serves as a stark reminder of how quickly lives can be destroyed by jealousy, manipulation, and the toxic aftermath of failed relationships. What began as a custody dispute between divorced parents escalated into a murder plot that destroyed multiple families and left a young child without her father. Ben Oxley was a man who had worked hard to build a new life after his divorce. He was devoted to his daughter, committed to his new marriage, and focused on the simple pleasures of honest work and family time. He deserved to live out his days in peace, watching his daughter grow up and building memories with the people he loved. Instead, his life was cut short by people who saw him as nothing more than an obstacle to their own happiness. His death was not the result of passion or a moment of poor judgment, but rather the culmination of careful planning and cold-blooded calculation. The case also highlighted the importance of listening to children who may be witnesses to crimes. Alyssa's testimony was crucial to solving her father's murder, but it came at a tremendous personal cost to a little girl who was forced to confront the reality of violence at far too young an age. In the years since the case was resolved, Melissa Oxley has become an advocate for forgiveness and healing in the aftermath of violent crime. Following Alyssa's example, she has spoken publicly about the power of forgiveness, even when it seems impossible to extend grace to those who have caused such pain. The Oxley case remains one of the most memorable and impactful investigations in Douglas County's history. It demonstrated the importance of thorough police work, the power of persistence in the face of challenges, and the crucial role that witnesses, even very young ones, can play in ensuring that justice is served. Today, James Matlean continues to serve his life sentence, with decades stretching ahead of him to contemplate the choices that led him to that bedroom in Mind in Nevada. He took the life of a man he barely knew, destroyed multiple families, and ensured that he would never again experience freedom, all for the sake of a woman who ultimately received immunity for her role in the crime. Dawn Oxley has served her federal prison sentence and has since been released. She remains a controversial figure in the case, having avoided murder charges despite what many believe was her central role in orchestrating Ben's death. The house where Ben Oxley was murdered still stands in the Wild Horse subdivision, a quiet reminder of the violence that shattered the peace of that February night. New families have lived there since, and life in Mendon has continued its ordinary rhythm. But for those who were touched by this case, the memory of what happened there will never fade. Ben Oxley's grave rests in a cemetery overlooking the Carson Valley, the mountain views stretching out toward the Sierra Nevada peaks he knew so well. His headstone bears simple words that capture the essence of who he was: a loving father, a devoted husband, and a man taken too soon. The case stands as a testament to the dedication of law enforcement officers like Detective Sergeant Ron Elges, who refused to give up when seeking justice for victims of violent crime. It also serves as a powerful reminder of the resilience of the human spirit, embodied by a young girl who found the strength to forgive even in the face of unimaginable loss. In the end, the murder of Ben Oxley was solved not by advanced forensic techniques or dramatic breakthroughs, but by old-fashioned police work, the courage of witnesses willing to come forward, and the testimony of a 6-year-old girl who helped ensure that her father's killer would face justice. As the desert winds continue to blow across the Carson Valley, and the seasons change over the Sierra Nevada mountains, Ben Oxley's story serves as both a tragedy and a testament to the power of truth, justice, and the extraordinary capacity for forgiveness that can emerge from even the darkest circumstances. The case file may be closed, but the lessons it teaches about family, violence, manipulation, and the price of jealousy remain as relevant today as they were on that cold February night, when a single shotgun blast changed so many lives forever. Please, if you're still awake, let's move on to our last story. Story 5. In the quiet mountains of Vermont, where autumn leaves paint the landscape in shades of gold and crimson, there are places where people go to find peace. Bolton Valley is one of those places, a ski resort town where couples escape for romantic getaways, where the crisp mountain air promises new beginnings. It was here in October 2021 that what should have been a celebration of love became one of the most disturbing cases of domestic violence Vermont had seen in years. This is the story of Emily Ferlazzo, a young woman whose life was cut tragically short at just 22 years old. And the man she trusted most, her husband Joseph, who would become her killer. It's a case that reveals the devastating reality of intimate partner violence, the dangerous dynamics that can exist behind closed doors, and the price of ignoring warning signs that in hindsight seemed impossible to miss. So as we settle, we'll explore this deeply troubling case, examining not just what happened in those Vermont mountains, but how a relationship that began with promise evolved into something deadly. Emily Schwartz was the kind of person who lit up a room. At 22, she possessed an infectious energy and optimism that drew people to her. Those who knew her described her as vivacious, kind-hearted, and full of life. Someone who saw the best in people and believed in second chances. She had grown up in New Hampshire, raised by her mother Adrienne Bass and stepfather David Bass, who provided her with a loving, stable home. Emily was at that exciting stage of young adulthood where the world felt full of possibilities. She was exploring who she was, what she wanted from life. And like many young people, she was open to adventure and new experiences. It was this openness, this willingness to embrace the unknown, that would eventually lead her to Joseph Ferlazzo. Joseph was 41 years old when he entered Emily's life, nearly 2 decades her senior. Where Emily was youthful and optimistic, Joseph carried the weight of middle age and whatever disappointments and frustrations had accumulated over the years. He was a man who had chosen an unconventional lifestyle, living in a converted Chevrolet Express bus, embracing what some might call the van life movement that had gained popularity in recent years. The van life community often attracts people seeking freedom from traditional societal expectations. Individuals who want to travel, explore, live simply, and find adventure on the open road. For some, it represents a genuine desire for minimalism and connection with nature. For others, it can be an escape from responsibilities or relationships that have gone wrong. When Emily and Joseph met, their age difference was stark and immediately noticeable to everyone around them. Friends and family members couldn't help but wonder what this young woman, who could have been dating men her own age with similar life experiences, saw in someone who was old enough to be her father. But Emily was drawn to Joseph's lifestyle, perhaps seeing in him the adventure and freedom she craved. The relationship moved quickly, perhaps too quickly, in a world where young people often take years to commit to serious relationships. Emily and Joseph's courtship was a whirlwind. Within months of meeting, they were planning a future together. Within a year, they were married. The wedding took place in October 2020, during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic. It was a time when many couples were having small, intimate ceremonies rather than large celebrations. For Emily and Joseph, this meant their wedding was a quiet affair, without the usual extended family gatherings and celebrations that might have provided more opportunities for loved ones to observe their dynamic and express any concerns. After the wedding, Emily moved into Joseph's converted bus, embracing the nomadic lifestyle she had found so appealing. They would travel together, seeing the country, living simply, and supposedly building a life based on shared adventures and mutual love. But those who knew Emily best were beginning to have concerns. Emily's mother, Adrienne Bass, had an intuitive sense that something wasn't right with her daughter's marriage. As mothers often do, she could detect subtle changes in Emily's behavior and demeanor that might not have been apparent to casual observers. There was something about Joseph that made Adrienne deeply uncomfortable, though she struggled to articulate exactly what it was. In interviews after Emily's death, Adrienne would describe having a sense of strong danger regarding her son-in-law. This wasn't based on any single incident or obvious red flag, but rather an accumulation of small observations and gut feelings that told her Emily was not safe. Adrienne noticed that Emily seemed different when Joseph was around, quieter, more subdued, as if she were walking on eggshells. The dynamics of their relationship were troubling to those who observed them closely. Joseph, at 41, had decades more life experience than Emily. He had lived through relationships, career challenges, personal setbacks, and all the complexities that come with middle age. Emily, at 22, was just beginning her adult life. This power imbalance wasn't just about age. It was about experience, confidence, and the ability to recognize and respond to manipulation or abuse. Those familiar with domestic violence know that abusive relationships rarely begin with obvious violence. Instead, they typically start with subtle forms of control that gradually escalate. The abuser might isolate their partner from friends and family, control their finances, monitor their activities, or undermine their self-confidence. By the time physical violence begins, the victim is often already emotionally and psychologically weakened, making it much harder for them to recognize the danger they're in or to seek help. In Emily and Joseph's case, the nomadic lifestyle they had chosen may have inadvertently facilitated this isolation. When you're constantly traveling, living in a small space together, relying on each other for companionship and support, it becomes very easy for one partner to control the other's access to outside relationships and support systems. Friends and family began to notice that Emily was less available than she had been before her marriage. Phone calls became less frequent. When she did communicate, she sometimes seemed guarded or distracted. These changes might seem minor to an outside observer, but to those who loved Emily, they were concerning. The converted bus that had once seemed like a symbol of freedom and adventure was beginning to feel more like a trap. Emily was living in a confined space with someone who was increasingly controlling her life, isolated from the support systems that might have helped her recognize the danger she was in. As 2021 progressed and their first wedding anniversary approached, Emily's family was growing more worried. They had hoped that time would help Emily realize that her marriage wasn't healthy, but instead she seemed to be withdrawing further from them. It was against this backdrop of growing concern that Emily and Joseph decided to take a trip to Vermont to celebrate their first wedding anniversary. What was intended as a romantic getaway would become the setting for a tragedy that would devastate Emily's family and shock everyone who knew them. October 2021 in Vermont is peak foliage season. The mountains are painted in brilliant reds, oranges, and yellows, creating some of the most spectacular scenery in New England. It's a time when tourists flock to the state to witness nature's grand finale before winter arrives. For couples looking for a romantic getaway, it doesn't get much more picturesque than Vermont in October. Emily and Joseph chose Bolton Valley as their destination. Bolton is a ski resort area, quieter than some of Vermont's more famous destinations like Stowe or Killington, but no less beautiful. During the off-season, before the winter skiing crowds arrive, it offers a peaceful retreat where couples can enjoy hiking, scenic drives, and cozy evenings together. The couple left New Hampshire on Friday, October 15th, 2021, driving their converted Chevrolet Express bus to Vermont. This wasn't unusual for them. They had been living this nomadic lifestyle for over a year, traveling from place to place, camping in their mobile home. The bus was their entire world: bedroom, kitchen, living room, and bathroom, all contained within the confines of their vehicle. In Bolton, they had plans to visit with Joseph's sister and her boyfriend, who had rented an Airbnb near the ski resort. This was meant to be a celebration not just of Emily and Joseph's anniversary, but of family connections and shared good times. Joseph's sister was looking forward to spending time with the couple and getting to know Emily better. The weekend began normally enough. Emily and Joseph spent time with Joseph's sister, exploring the area, enjoying the beautiful autumn weather, and participating in the kind of activities that make Vermont such a popular destination. On the surface, everything appeared to be going well. They seemed like a couple enjoying their anniversary celebration in one of New England's most beautiful settings. But beneath the surface, tension was building. According to Joseph's later confession to police, he and Emily had been drinking alcohol on the evening of October 17th. Alcohol often serves as a catalyst in domestic violence situations, lowering inhibitions and escalating conflicts that might otherwise remain verbal. For someone with controlling tendencies, alcohol can remove the social filters that normally keep violent impulses in check. What started as a typical evening in their cramped living quarters soon devolved into an argument. The exact details of what triggered the fight may never be fully known. Domestic disputes often begin over seemingly trivial matters that mask deeper relationship problems. What we do know is that in the confined space of their converted bus, with nowhere for either of them to go to cool off, the argument escalated quickly. Joseph would later claim that Emily became physical during this argument, alleging that she punched and kicked him. He would use this claim as the foundation for his self-defense argument, though the physical evidence would later contradict his version of events. Emily, at 22 and much smaller than her 41-year-old husband, was hardly a physical match for Joseph. As the argument continued, Emily eventually went to lie down, perhaps trying to de-escalate the situation or simply exhausted from the conflict. This should have been the end of it. Couples argue. Emotions run high, and then people separate to calm down. In healthy relationships, this is exactly what happens. But Joseph's reaction was far from normal. Instead of allowing the situation to cool down, instead of taking time to process his emotions, or consider how to repair the damage done by their argument, Joseph made a decision that would destroy both of their lives forever. He waited. For 5 to 10 minutes, he sat in their bus thinking, planning, letting his anger build rather than subside. Then he retrieved his Glock 19 pistol. What happened next in those terrible minutes inside the converted bus represents one of the most cold-blooded and calculated acts of domestic violence on record. This wasn't a crime of passion, a moment of lost control, or even a response to immediate threat. This was deliberate, planned, and utterly without justification. Joseph would later tell police that after Emily lay down, he waited 5 to 10 minutes before making his move. This detail is crucial because it completely undermines any claim of self-defense or heat of passion killing. If Joseph had genuinely felt threatened by Emily, if he had truly been acting in self-defense, he would have responded immediately to protect himself. Instead, he took time to consider his actions, retrieved a weapon, and made a conscious decision to kill his wife. The Glock 19 is a serious weapon, a 9mm pistol commonly used by law enforcement and military personnel. It's not the kind of gun someone keeps for casual protection or sport shooting. The fact that Joseph had this weapon with him on their anniversary trip raises questions about his intentions and state of mind. Joseph approached Emily while she was lying down, defenseless and unaware of the danger she was in. In what can only be described as an execution, he jumped on top of her, pressed the gun to her head, and fired twice. The close-range gunshot wounds to Emily's head would have killed her instantly. She never had a chance to defend herself, to run, or even to understand what was happening to her. The brutality didn't end there. After killing Emily, Joseph placed a garbage bag over her head, a detail that speaks to his awareness of what he had done and his immediate concern with containing the mess rather than seeking help or showing any remorse. He then moved her body into the bathroom area of their converted bus, the most confined space in their already cramped living quarters. But even this wasn't the end of Joseph's horrific actions. For the next 12 to 15 hours, Joseph remained in the bus with Emily's body. During this time, he made another decision that revealed the true depths of his depravity. Using a handsaw, he dismembered Emily's body, cutting it into pieces that he then placed in large trash bags. The dismemberment wasn't necessary for disposing of the body. Many murderers managed to hide their victims without resorting to such extreme measures. Instead, this appears to have been an act of rage, control, and dehumanization. Even in death, Joseph couldn't stop trying to exert his dominance over Emily. The medical examiner would later determine that Emily had not only been shot twice in the head, but had also been stabbed 18 times post-mortem. This means that after she was already dead from the gunshot wounds, Joseph continued to attack her body with a knife. These were not defensive wounds or injuries sustained during a struggle. They were deliberate acts of violence committed against someone who could no longer fight back. The psychological profile that emerges from these details is deeply disturbing. Joseph's actions reveal someone consumed by rage and control issues. Someone who saw Emily not as a human being deserving of love and respect, but as an object that belonged to him. When she failed to comply with his expectations, when their argument challenged his sense of dominance, he decided she deserved to die. The fact that he then spent hours mutilating her body suggests that even her death wasn't enough to satisfy his need for control. He had to continue degrading and dehumanizing her, even when she could no longer pose any threat to him. Throughout this entire nightmare, Joseph was alone with his actions and their consequences. He had hours to consider what he had done, to feel remorse, to call for help, to turn himself in. Instead, he methodically planned how to cover up his crime and escape responsibility for his actions. After spending more than half a day dismembering Emily's body and cleaning up the crime scene, Joseph began executing what he hoped would be a successful cover-up of his wife's murder. His actions during this phase reveal a calculating mindset focused entirely on self-preservation rather than any genuine remorse for what he had done. Joseph packed Emily's remains in large trash bags, treating her body with the same casual disregard he might show to actual garbage. He then began the process of disposing of the evidence, though the exact locations where he attempted to hide Emily's remains weren't immediately discovered by investigators. The confined space of their converted bus made it impossible to completely eliminate all traces of what had occurred. Despite Joseph's efforts to clean up, forensic evidence of the brutal murder remained. Blood evidence, despite attempted cleanup, would later be discovered by crime scene investigators. The bathroom area where Emily's body had been dismembered retained traces of the horrific violence that had occurred there. After disposing of Emily's remains and attempting to clean the bus, Joseph faced the challenge of explaining his wife's absence to their family members. He couldn't simply disappear. Too many people knew they had traveled to Vermont together for their anniversary celebration. His sister was expecting to see them both, and Emily's family back in New Hampshire would be wondering why they hadn't heard from their daughter. Joseph decided to return to New Hampshire without Emily, arriving at the property belonging to Emily's parents without his wife. This was an incredibly bold move that demonstrated either supreme confidence in his ability to lie convincingly, or a complete disconnect from the reality of his situation. When questioned about Emily's whereabouts, Joseph told family members that she had decided to stay in Vermont longer, claiming she had wanted to extend their anniversary trip. This explanation might have seemed plausible at first. Couples sometimes make spontaneous decisions to extend vacations, and Emily's family had no reason to immediately suspect that something terrible had happened to her. However, those who knew Emily well found Joseph's explanation difficult to believe. Emily was close to her family and regularly kept in touch with them. The idea that she would extend a trip without contacting them directly seemed out of character. More concerning was the fact that Emily wasn't answering her phone or responding to text messages from her mother and other family members. Emily's mother, Adrienne Bass, had already been concerned about her daughter's marriage and Joseph's treatment of her. When Joseph returned without Emily and couldn't provide a satisfactory explanation for her absence, Adrienne's worst fears began to surface. The gut feeling she had experienced about Joseph's dangerous nature now seemed to have been validated. As hours passed and Emily remained unreachable, her family's concern grew into alarm. This wasn't like Emily. She was responsible, loving, and maintained regular contact with her family. Despite the nomadic lifestyle she had chosen, her sudden silence, combined with Joseph's evasive explanations, created a sense of urgency that prompted her family to contact law enforcement. When police began investigating Emily's disappearance, they immediately focused on Joseph as the primary person of interest. In missing person cases involving married couples, the spouse is always the first person investigators examined. And Joseph's story about Emily choosing to stay in Vermont while he returned home raised immediate red flags. Under questioning, Joseph's carefully constructed story began to fall apart. Police investigators are trained to detect inconsistencies in statements, and Joseph's account of events contained numerous problems that became apparent under scrutiny. His explanations for Emily's absence were vague and changed when pressed for details. He couldn't provide specific information about where Emily was supposedly staying or why she hadn't contacted her family. As the investigation intensified and the evidence mounted against him, Joseph eventually made the decision to confess to Emily's murder. Whether this confession was motivated by genuine remorse, the realization that he couldn't maintain his lies in the face of police scrutiny, or simply a strategic decision to try to minimize his legal consequences, only Joseph knows. When Joseph Ferlazzo finally decided to confess to murdering his wife Emily, it marked the end of any pretense that this had been anything other than a deliberate, calculated killing. His confession to police investigators provided crucial details about the crime that would later be corroborated by forensic evidence, establishing a clear timeline and methodology that contradicted any possible claims of self-defense or accidental death. The confession process in criminal cases is always significant, but Joseph's admission was particularly revealing because of the specific details he provided about his actions. Rather than offering a vague acknowledgement of wrongdoing, Joseph walked investigators through the entire sequence of events, from the initial argument with Emily through the dismemberment of her body and disposal of her remains. Joseph told police that the fatal confrontation began with an argument between him and Emily in their converted bus. According to his account, they had been drinking alcohol on the evening of October 17th, 2021. When the dispute began, he claimed that Emily became physically aggressive during this argument, alleging that she punched and kicked him. This claim of physical aggression from Emily would later become central to Joseph's legal defense strategy. His attorneys would argue that he had acted in self-defense, responding to an attack from his wife. However, the evidence would ultimately show that this narrative was not supported by the physical facts of the case. Joseph described how Emily eventually went to lie down, presumably to end the argument or de-escalate the situation. This detail is crucial because it establishes that Emily had removed herself from the conflict and was no longer engaged in any aggressive behavior toward Joseph. In a genuine self-defense situation, this would have been the end of the confrontation. Instead, Joseph admitted to police that he waited 5 to 10 minutes after Emily lay down before taking action. This waiting period completely undermines any claim of self-defense or heat of passion killing. If Joseph had genuinely felt threatened by Emily, if he had truly been acting to protect himself from immediate harm, he would have responded immediately. The fact that he took time to consider his next move proves that this was a deliberate, premeditated act. During this waiting period, Joseph retrieved his Glock 19 pistol. The fact that he had this weapon readily available in their living space raises additional questions about the dynamics of their relationship and whether Emily had previously been threatened or intimidated by the presence of firearms. Joseph then approached Emily, who was lying down and unaware of the danger she was in what can only be described as an execution-style killing. He jumped on top of her and shot her twice in the head at close range. The positioning and nature of these gunshot wounds would later be confirmed by the medical examiner, establishing that Emily had no opportunity to defend herself or escape. After killing Emily, Joseph's actions became even more disturbing. He placed a garbage bag over her head, moved her body to the bathroom area of their bus, and then spent the next 12 to 15 hours systematically dismembering her body using a handsaw. He also stabbed her 18 times post-mortem, though he provided no explanation for this additional violence against his already dead wife. Joseph described to police how he placed Emily's dismembered remains in large trash bags and disposed of them, though the exact locations where he attempted to hide her body parts required additional investigation to discover. He also detailed his efforts to clean up the crime scene within their bus, though forensic investigators would later find blood evidence despite his cleanup attempts. The confession concluded with Joseph's account of his return to New Hampshire without Emily and his attempts to explain her absence to family members. He admitted to lying about Emily's whereabouts, claiming she had decided to extend their Vermont trip when in reality he had already killed her. What's particularly striking about Joseph's confession is the matter-of-fact way he described these horrific actions. There was no expression of remorse, no emotional breakdown, no indication that he fully comprehended the magnitude of what he had done. Instead, he provided details with the same detachment he might use to describe any routine activity. This emotional disconnect would become a theme throughout the legal proceedings that followed. Even when faced with the full consequences of his actions, Joseph continued to show little genuine remorse for Emily's death, instead focusing primarily on his own situation and attempting to justify his behavior. Once Emily's family reported her missing and police began investigating her disappearance, it quickly became apparent that this was not a typical missing person case. The circumstances surrounding Emily's absence, combined with Joseph's inconsistent and implausible explanations, immediately raised red flags for investigators experienced in domestic violence cases. The investigation began in New Hampshire, where Joseph had returned without Emily, but quickly expanded to Vermont, where the couple had last been seen together during their anniversary trip. Vermont State Police, working in coordination with New Hampshire authorities, began piecing together the timeline of events and searching for evidence of what had actually happened to Emily. One of the first priorities for investigators was locating and examining the converted Chevrolet Express bus that had served as Emily and Joseph's mobile home. This vehicle represented the primary crime scene, and despite Joseph's efforts to clean up after the murder, forensic investigators were able to find crucial evidence that corroborated his eventual confession. Crime scene technicians discovered blood evidence in the bathroom area of the bus. Despite attempts to clean it up, modern forensic techniques can detect even trace amounts of blood that appear to have been completely removed. And the patterns and locations of this evidence told a story that matched Joseph's description of events. The forensic investigation also revealed evidence consistent with the dismemberment of a body within the confined space of the bus bathroom. The logistics of dismembering a human body in such a small area would have been extremely difficult and messy, making it virtually impossible to eliminate all traces of what had occurred. Meanwhile, search teams began the grim task of trying to locate Emily's remains. Based on Joseph's confession and their knowledge of the area where the couple had been staying, investigators conducted extensive searches of the Bolton Valley region and surrounding areas. This process was complicated by Vermont's dense forests and mountainous terrain, which provided numerous potential locations where someone might attempt to hide a body. The search for Emily's remains was not just about recovering evidence. It was also about providing her family with the closure that comes from being able to properly lay their loved one to rest. For Emily's mother and stepfather, the knowledge that their daughter's body had been dismembered and scattered was almost unbearable, but they needed to recover her remains to begin the grieving process. As investigators dug deeper into Emily and Joseph's relationship, they began to uncover evidence of the domestic violence that had preceded the murder. Interviews with family members and friends revealed a pattern of controlling behavior and red flags that suggested Emily had been living in an abusive relationship for some time before her death. Emily's mother, Adrienne Bass, provided investigators with crucial background information about her concerns regarding Joseph. She described the sense of danger she had felt around him and her growing worry about Emily's safety in the months leading up to the murder. This testimony would later prove important in establishing the context of domestic violence that surrounded Emily's death. Investigators also examined the couple's financial records, travel patterns, and communications to build a comprehensive picture of their relationship and the events leading up to Emily's murder. This type of thorough investigation is crucial in domestic violence cases, where the killer often has intimate knowledge of the victim's habits and weaknesses. The investigation revealed that Joseph had a history of controlling behavior toward Emily, isolating her from friends and family and monitoring her activities. The nomadic lifestyle they had chosen, while appearing to offer freedom and adventure, had actually served to cut Emily off from potential sources of support and assistance. As evidence mounted and the investigation progressed, it became clear that Emily's murder was not an isolated incident, but rather the tragic culmination of an abusive relationship that had been escalating over time. The warning signs had been there, but Emily had been too isolated and perhaps too intimidated to seek help. The thoroughness of the police investigation would prove crucial when the case eventually went to trial. Every piece of evidence, every witness statement, and every forensic finding would be needed to counter Joseph's planned defense strategy and ensure that justice was served for Emily's murder. The legal proceedings in the case of Joseph Ferlazzo began with his arrest and charging with first-degree murder in the death of his wife Emily. The decision to charge first-degree murder rather than a lesser offense reflected the prosecution's assessment that this was a premeditated, deliberate killing rather than a crime of passion or self-defense. First-degree murder charges require prosecutors to prove that the killing was planned and deliberate, not spontaneous or accidental. In Joseph's case, the evidence supporting premeditation included the 5 to 10 minute waiting period between Emily lying down and Joseph retrieving his weapon, the execution-style nature of the shooting, and the extensive post-mortem mutilation of Emily's body. Joseph initially pleaded not guilty to the murder charges, setting up what would become a lengthy legal battle over the circumstances of Emily's death. His defense team, recognizing that Joseph had already confessed to killing Emily, focused on trying to establish grounds for a self-defense claim that might reduce his culpability or the severity of charges against him. The self-defense strategy was problematic from the start, given the physical evidence in Joseph's own confession about the timeline of events. Self-defense requires that the person using deadly force reasonably believed they were in immediate danger of death or serious bodily harm, and that the force used was necessary to prevent that harm. Joseph's claim that Emily had punched and kicked him during their argument, even if true, would not justify shooting her twice in the head after she had already removed herself from the confrontation by lying down. The fact that he waited several minutes before taking action further undermined any claim that he was responding to an immediate threat. The case attracted significant media attention, partly because it occurred around the same time as the highly publicized Gabby Petito case, which involved another young woman who was killed by her romantic partner during a cross-country trip. The similarities between the cases, young women traveling with older, controlling partners who ultimately killed them, highlighted the epidemic of domestic violence and intimate partner homicide that affects thousands of women each year. Prosecutors in the case were led by Chittenden County State's Attorney Sarah George, who had extensive experience in prosecuting domestic violence cases. The prosecution's strategy focused on presenting the overwhelming evidence of premeditation and the brutal nature of Emily's killing, while also educating the jury about the dynamics of domestic violence that had led to this tragedy. The prosecution highlighted several key pieces of evidence that contradicted Joseph's self-defense claims. The waiting period between Emily lying down and Joseph retrieving his weapon demonstrated premeditation rather than immediate response to threat. The close-range, execution-style gunshot wounds to Emily's head showed that she had no opportunity to defend herself or pose any threat to Joseph. The extensive post-mortem stabbing and dismemberment of Emily's body revealed a level of rage and control that went far beyond any reasonable claim of self-defense. The prosecution also presented testimony from Emily's family members about the pattern of controlling and abusive behavior they had observed in Joseph's treatment of Emily. This testimony was crucial for helping the jury understand that Emily's murder was not an isolated incident, but rather the culmination of an abusive relationship. As the case proceeded through the court system, Joseph's defense team continued to maintain that he had acted in self-defense, despite the overwhelming evidence to the contrary. This defense strategy was not uncommon in domestic violence cases, where abusers often attempt to portray themselves as victims and their murdered partners as aggressors. The legal proceedings would ultimately culminate in a trial that would force Emily's family to relive the trauma of her death while seeking justice for her murder. For the Bass family, the trial represented both an opportunity to hold Joseph accountable for his actions and a painful reminder of all they had lost when Emily was killed. The trial of Joseph Ferlazzo for the first-degree murder of his wife Emily began in December 2024, more than 3 years after Emily's death. The delay between the crime and trial was not unusual for a complex murder case, as both prosecution and defense needed time to prepare their arguments and examine the extensive evidence that had been collected during the investigation. The trial took place in Vermont, where Emily had been killed, and drew significant attention from media outlets covering domestic violence cases. For Emily's family, the trial represented their best chance to see justice served for their daughter's murder, though they knew that no legal outcome could bring Emily back or undo the trauma they had experienced. Jury selection was a crucial process in this case, as potential jurors needed to be able to fairly consider evidence about domestic violence and not be swayed by any preconceptions about self-defense claims and intimate partner relationships. The judge and attorneys questioned potential jurors extensively about their ability to remain impartial and base their verdict solely on the evidence presented at trial. The prosecution, led by the Chittenden County State's Attorney's Office, opened their case by presenting a clear timeline of events that demonstrated the premeditated nature of Emily's murder. Prosecutor Stephen Shapiro told jurors about the brutal facts of the case, that Emily had been shot twice in the head and stabbed 18 times post-mortem, and that her cause of death was clearly homicide. The prosecution's opening statement emphasized that this case was about Joseph's ego and his inability to handle being challenged by his much younger wife. They argued that when Emily failed to conform to his expectations during their anniversary trip, Joseph made a deliberate decision to kill her rather than allow her to assert any independence or autonomy in their relationship. Key evidence presented by the prosecution included Joseph's own confession, which detailed his actions from the initial argument through the dismemberment and disposal of Emily's body. Forensic evidence from the crime scene, including blood evidence found in the bathroom of their converted bus despite cleanup attempts. Medical examiner testimony about Emily's injuries, which were consistent with an execution-style killing rather than self-defense. Testimony from Emily's family about the pattern of controlling behavior they had observed in Joseph's treatment of Emily. The defense team faced the challenging task of trying to justify Joseph's actions despite his confession and the overwhelming physical evidence. Their strategy centered on claiming that Joseph had acted in self-defense when Emily allegedly became physically aggressive during their argument. Defense attorneys argued that Joseph had been the victim of domestic violence in the relationship, claiming that Emily had punched and kicked him during their final argument. They suggested that Joseph's response, while extreme, was justified by his fear for his own safety. However, this defense strategy faced several significant problems. The physical evidence contradicted claims that Joseph had been acting in immediate self-defense. Emily's size and age compared to Joseph's made claims of her being a serious physical threat difficult to believe. The 5 to 10 minute delay between Emily lying down and Joseph retrieving his weapon showed premeditation rather than immediate response to threat. Perhaps most damaging to the defense case was the extensive post-mortem violence inflicted on Emily's body. Even if the initial shooting could somehow be justified as self-defense, there was no possible justification for the 18 stab wounds inflicted after Emily was already dead from gunshot wounds to the head. Testimony during the trial revealed disturbing details about the crime that had not been previously disclosed to the public. The medical examiner described the close-range nature of the gunshot wounds and the pattern of stab wounds that showed Emily had been attacked after death. Crime scene investigators explained how Joseph had attempted to clean up evidence of the murder, but had been unsuccessful in eliminating all traces of what had occurred. Emily's family members provided emotional testimony about the impact her death had on their lives. Her mother, Adrienne Bass, described her growing concerns about Joseph's treatment of Emily, and her sense that her daughter was in danger. The family's testimony helped humanize Emily for the jury, showing her as a real person with hopes, dreams, and people who loved her, rather than just a victim in a criminal case. Throughout the trial, Joseph showed little emotion or remorse for his actions. Even when confronted with the graphic details of what he had done to Emily, he appeared detached and focused primarily on his own situation rather than the harm he had caused to Emily and her family. The trial proceedings were difficult for everyone involved, but particularly for Emily's family, who had to hear repeated descriptions of the violence that had been inflicted on their loved one. However, they were determined to see the case through to ensure that Joseph was held accountable for his actions. After hearing all the evidence and testimony, the jury in Joseph Ferlazzo's murder trial began their deliberations on December 12th. The deliberation process in murder cases is always intense, as jurors must carefully consider all evidence and apply the legal standards for the charges they are considering. In this case, the jury had to determine whether Joseph was guilty of first-degree murder, which required proof that the killing was premeditated and deliberate, or whether his actions might fall under some lesser charge. They also had to evaluate his claim of self-defense and determine whether it had any merit based on the evidence presented. The jury deliberated for several hours before reaching their verdict. On December 12, 2024, they found Joseph Ferlazzo guilty of first-degree murder in the death of his wife Emily. The verdict reflected their conclusion that Joseph had deliberately and with premeditation killed Emily, and that his claims of self-defense were not supported by the evidence. The guilty verdict brought a measure of justice for Emily's family, though nothing could truly compensate for their loss. Joseph Ferlazzo was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole for the murder of his 22-year-old wife Emily, ensuring that he would never again have the opportunity to harm another person. for Emily's mother, Adrienne Bass. The verdict validated her instincts about Joseph and the danger he posed to her daughter. While she took some satisfaction in knowing that Joseph would face the full consequences of his actions, the victory felt hollow compared to the magnitude of her loss. The murder of Emily Ferlazzo serves as a tragic reminder of the deadly reality of domestic violence in America. Every year, intimate partner violence affects millions of people, with women being disproportionately likely to be killed by current or former romantic partners. Emily's case illustrates how quickly controlling behavior can escalate to lethal violence, especially when victims are isolated from support systems that might help them recognize danger and seek help. The age gap between Emily and Joseph was significant at 22. Emily was still developing her sense of self and learning to navigate adult relationships, while Joseph at 41 had decades more life experience and psychological development. This imbalance made it easier for Joseph to manipulate and control Emily, gradually isolating her from family and friends who might have been able to help her recognize the warning signs of abuse. The nomadic lifestyle that had initially attracted Emily, the freedom of van life and constant travel, ultimately became a tool of isolation that made her more vulnerable to Joseph's control. When you're living in a small, confined space with someone, constantly moving from place to place without stable connections to community or support systems, it becomes much easier for an abuser to monitor and control every aspect of their partner's life. Emily's family, particularly her mother Adrienne, had recognized that something was wrong with the relationship, but they faced the common dilemma of family members who are concerned about a loved one's abusive partner. How do you help someone who doesn't seem to recognize that they need help? How do you intervene without pushing them further away? The warning signs were there. Emily's withdrawal from family, her changed demeanor when Joseph was around, her mother's intuitive sense of danger. But like many victims of domestic violence, Emily may not have fully recognized the severity of her situation until it was too late. The brutal nature of Emily's murder, not just the initial shooting, but the extensive post-mortem violence and dismemberment, reveals the depth of Joseph's need to control and dominate. Even in death, he couldn't allow Emily to maintain her dignity or humanity. This level of violence goes beyond what might be expected even in the worst domestic violence cases, suggesting a profound psychological disturbance that made Joseph extremely dangerous to anyone in an intimate relationship with him. The case also highlights the importance of trusting instincts when something feels wrong about a relationship or situation. Emily's mother's sense of strong danger regarding Joseph proved to be tragically accurate. While it's impossible to know whether earlier intervention might have saved Emily's life, her case serves as a reminder to take such concerns seriously and to keep trying to reach out to loved ones who may be in dangerous relationships. For those working in domestic violence prevention and intervention, Emily's case underscores the need for better education about the warning signs of abuse, particularly in relationships with significant age gaps or power imbalances. It also demonstrates the importance of maintaining connections with potential victims, even when they seem to be pulling away, as isolation is both a tactic used by abusers and a risk factor for escalating violence. The trial and conviction of Joseph Ferlazzo ensured that he will never again have the opportunity to harm another partner. However, his case is just one of many that occur each year, as intimate partner violence continues to claim the lives of women across the country. Each case represents not just a criminal act, but a failure of society to adequately protect vulnerable individuals from those who would harm them. Emily Ferlazzo was 22 years old when her life was cut short by the person who had promised to love and protect her. She was described by those who knew her as vivacious, kind-hearted, and full of life, someone who saw the best in people and believed in second chances. These qualities, which made her such a beloved daughter, friend, and person, may have also made her vulnerable to someone like Joseph, who was skilled at manipulation and control. In the quiet mountains of Vermont, where Emily and Joseph had gone to celebrate their first wedding anniversary, autumn leaves continue to turn brilliant colors each October. The natural beauty of the area remains unchanged, but for Emily's family, those mountains will forever be associated with the worst day of their lives. Emily's memory lives on through her family and friends, who remember her not as a victim of domestic violence, but as a young woman who brought joy and light into their lives. Her death serves as a reminder that domestic violence can affect anyone, regardless of age, background, or circumstances, and that the warning signs of abuse should never be ignored. The case of Emily Ferlazzo is now closed, with her killer serving life in prison without the possibility of parole. But her story continues to serve as an important reminder about the realities of domestic violence and the need for all of us to be vigilant in protecting those we love from those who would harm them. For anyone listening who may be in a controlling or abusive relationship, Emily's story is a reminder that help is available and that it's never too late to reach out for support. The National Domestic Violence Hotline provides confidential support 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, and can be reached by calling 1-800-799-7233 or by visiting their website. Emily's life mattered. Her death was preventable, and her story serves as both a tragedy and a call to action for all of us to do better in protecting those who are vulnerable to intimate partner violence. In memory of Emily Ferlazzo, may we all work to create a world where young women like her can live free from fear and violence, where love truly means safety and respect, and where no one has to die at the hands of someone who claimed to care for them. This has been a story of Emily Ferlazzo. May she rest in peace. Thank you for listening to tonight's true crime story. Rest peacefully knowing that another story awaits you next time, ready to accompany you on another journey toward restorative sleep. But if you're still awake, don't forget to like and subscribe so you don't miss our next true crime stories. And until next time, stay safe and take care. Good night.